Hi, welcome everyone. Thank you. We're starting a little late. Tonight's meeting was planned as a special school board meeting to offer continued conversation or begin the conversation with the school board members that were looking to district leaders and those that are responsible for assisting us with the BHS re-envisioning discussion. So I will call to do a Pledge of Allegiance. Okay. Thanks. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. And I'd like to make a motion to approve the agenda. Do I have a first and a second? Thank you, Commissioner Carey. The agenda stands. Any additions or modifications to the agenda? Seeing none. All right, I'd like to approve the agenda. All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Any abstentions? Okay, the motion passes. The agenda is approved. Next on the agenda is the BHS renovation presentation. Superintendent Obeng, thank you.
Thank you, Chair Wool and board members. Once again, we're here to provide the board with information and try to clarify any questions you may have on the project. I know we've had a number of different sessions on different topics around the BHS re-envisioning project. And I've got a bit of an agenda so we can try to be strategic around going through some of the areas. Thank you for those who were able to send questions. We tried to incorporate that into our initial presentation, but we also have many of our experts and consultants here tonight to facilitate some questions that you may have. So this is an opportunity for the board to get deeper in terms of learning around the entire project. And you've been consuming a lot of information in a short period of time. So please take this opportunity to get clarification around. We'll do our best to try to give you that information. Just quickly to go over through the agenda so people know where I know each of you may have specific areas that you want to dig into. So if you look at the agenda we've laid out there, so first we'll just show the possible motion that we want the board to consider that we would be able to take to City Council to consider putting on the ballot. Then we're going to talk about the building options again. You've seen the options, but we'll just do a quick recap just so you know what we're talking about in terms of options 1, 2, and 3. We did have a chance to do a survey over the last 4 or 5 days, and not totally scientific, but the sample size is pretty good. I think that'll give the board some additional information in terms of considerations. And then we're going to move into the real opportunity for questions and answer. And we've kind of grouped it, and we're going to talk once again around tax impact based on the most current information, our own annual budget impact, so questions around that. And then we can talk about our total indebtedness at the end. And then finally, we hope to relieve the rest of the evening to just do some queries around the building and the site itself with Marty and the consultants and go through that. We've left an opportunity for public, and I know city councilors will be coming this evening at some point, so we hope that towards the end, an opportunity for them to ask their questions to us, and we'll attempt to respond to that as well. We also have at the end of the evening an exit card for participants who are here to give us some input on next steps, because we've got a lot of feedback from people, and a lot of it is around the next steps, really, not really around this step, but so people might have some thoughts or ideas or something that they hear today. They may want to give us some heads up in terms of moving forward. So with that, I'll move to the next slide. You've seen this. You saw it last time we were here. I can't remember if it was last week or the week before, but it's the ballot language, and we've given that prose there for the board to kind of preview. This is what we'd be sharing with the City Council. This was sort of developed by our lawyer in terms of how to lay out the language. I think there's some areas that if you wanted to expand or add some additional language, you'd be free to do that. But the most critical part is the blank spot that says blank $1 million, and that's where we'd fill in how many millions that we're asking for at some point, right? Okay, next slide. And I'll turn it over to Marty just to go over what we're talking about for, we know that since we're being broadcasted, there are also community members who are maybe just getting into the game right now, and they might have heard about the options and things, so I think it's important to have people realize what we're actually talking about. And people can also go onto our website and see the previous slides and get more contextual information around some of the items that we're speaking to. So, Marty?
So the three options that we focused on for discussion this evening are the option A for a $60 million bond, option B for a $65 million bond, or option C, a $68.5 million bond. All three of those options include major upgrades to the building envelope, which include new insulation to that exterior envelope, new windows, new roofs, new mechanical system upgrades throughout the complex, new LED lighting, and as well as an upgraded sprinkler system. And throughout the entire project, we're going to meet all current accessibility ADA codes. So the difference between the three scenarios come down to, in our option A scenario, or actually our option A and B scenario, what we're suggesting is that the level of upgrades that we're going to be adding to the F building tech center. So not only to all programs of the tech center, because we do have a couple of programs that are in our A building that will get a full renovation, and we're also proposing to move our tech center administration. But the programs specifically that are in F building will have limited upgrades to those programs, which will basically reflect a $25 per square foot upgrade, whereas our scenario C option brings those upgrades up to $151 per square foot option, very similar to the proposed renovations that we're doing in A building, A and B building. And we can get into the questions about what that really looks like later in the presentation. The other option that separates option A and B and C is around our CHIPS design criteria. In our scenario A, where we would not be proposing to follow through with a CHIPS design certification. So that doesn't mean that we're not necessarily following components of a collaborative high performance design, but we will not be going through the process of getting that level of certification and or hiring a CHIPS consultant to make sure that we're in line with meeting all of those goals of that certification. Second scenario, we would be meeting our, minimum requirements. Minimum is not necessarily the right word, but so CHIPS is broken out by points. It has a minimum of 85 points with a maximum of 250 points. We would be doing a design more on the lower level, still meeting that certification, whereas scenario C, we would be designing to a higher level, which will give us a greater performing building. So our scenarios A, B, and C under building materials, when we can get into this level of detail later in the presentation, but we would be using lesser expensive building materials in the A option versus a greater, more durable materials in B and C. The air conditioning option in our A scenario would be, we would be not proposing to not air condition any of the building or any of the new spaces. Our B scenarios would be limited air conditioning to offices in some common areas, and our C scenario is air conditioning limited to office common areas with some level of dehumidification in the classrooms. And later in the presentation, we can talk to our mechanical engineer to understand what that means. We also will be able to talk about what it would look like if the board so chose to include air conditioning throughout the complex and what that cost would entail. And then just the other pieces around furniture, the scenario A option is, our fit up budget would be minimum meeting the needs of buying new furniture and equipment for all new spaces, but probably reusing a lot of furniture throughout the building where we can, whereas the other two scenarios we'd be upgrading, purchasing new furniture and equipment throughout, which is desperately needed in this building.
Thank you. Next, we'll move to the communications, and over to Russ.
Okay, thank you, Board. On Friday, the chair and I had a conversation just regarding wanting to get some sense of feel of how the community was feeling about a proposed bond and what those questions would look like. Claire and I had talked about having I had talked more about having some options, and Claire had talked more about should we ask an existential question of does the community support this or not. So what I did is I sort of combined those two ideas. We had a survey which did lay out all those options, but it also laid out another option that says I do not support a bond at this time, and I thought that that was very important for you all to sort of see how people were feeling. So we spread the word far and wide through many different channels. Social media, email, front porch forum, text messaging, basically all of our contacts. And I think it's also important to note that it was like a non-biased list. We sent it to everybody, and I would tell people, I don't care how you answer, just answer so that our board has an idea of what the community feels. So as Yao said, it is not a scientific study. I did some quick back of the envelope on SurveyMonkey. They say that for a population of Burlington size at a 95% confidence level with a 5% error margin, you would want a sample size of 381. We had 401 people take the survey, which is great. Now, some of those people, as you saw in your response, they were not Burlington residents, so I don't think we quite hit that confidence level, but we did have great response. So as you can see from this slide and the next slide, 401 respondents, and a vast majority, 70%, said they would support a bond on the November ballot of $68.5 million. I wanted to dig in a little bit more. I sent you all the results, but another one of the questions that we posed was we basically gave people an option that says, I support a bond on the ballot, but I think it should be for a different amount. And we gave people an opportunity to weigh in and actually write down what their answers were. We had 30 of those responses, which works out to another 7.5% of people who said they would support some bond on the ballot, just they don't know how much. So what I did is I read each of those answers, and you have each of those answers too, so if you disagree with the way that I've sort of categorized them, you'll be able to read that on your own. But of the 30, I found 9 of those responses that were definitively said that they would vote for more than 68.5 million. I found 4 that definitively said they would vote for less than 60 million, and I found 2 people who said that they would vote for any amount on a bond that would give us the flagship infrastructure that our children needed. So I read that as saying 79.5% of the people who took this survey would support putting a bond on the November ballot of 60, 65, or $68.5 million. Of the people who took the survey, including the 9 more and the 2 for any amount, that brings us up to 72.5% of the people who took this survey would support $68.5 million or more bond on the ballot.
You gonna do questions about that?
Right, so
I'm happy to answer any questions if there are questions.
any questions around the survey?
And before I answer questions, I would encourage you to read through the 183 pieces of feedback that they want you to read.
So you said you reached out to, as far and wide as you could to sort of disseminate the survey. But would you say that by and large, most of the respondents were people in the school community? Or, I mean, I guess we had Front Porch Forum as well, so that's one where it would be a wider net than just the school community.
Well, I think you would say, I think when Russ looks at it, I think he would say yes, because some of the information we asked previously around if they have children in the system,
Okay.
their emails, stuff that gives us indication, so you can drill down. But the majority of people have contact with the schools in some fashion, right? But you can count each one if we wanted to get that.
Sure, but I will say that of the 401, we made a mandatory question was what ward do you live in? 1 through 8 with the option of I do not live in Burlington, so 16 people that took the survey don't live in Burlington. The other question that we asked was what describes your affiliation with the district? And what we did here, and this is a failure, and I think we can learn from for budgeting season, we always are trying to get better. We asked if you are a parent of an elementary school student, a parent of a middle school student, a parent of a high school student, or a Burlington resident without children in the system. So Burlington, 20% of our responses came from Burlington residents without children in the system. If I was to design it again, based on feedback from the community, I would include a question in there that says, are you a teacher in the Burlington School District? Other community feedback I received, and I think this is a decision that we would want to make as a communication team, is some people felt like we were unfairly trying to pit sides against each other, to say whether when we asked this question, they felt that it was unfair to ask if you had kids in the system or not. I wanted to show if there was in fact broad community support for this, even if no one had children in the system. However, some people felt like it was doing an us against them. Only people with children in the system are voting for this or something of that nature. So that's something that we can consider. I don't think you can make everybody happy, but the most data that we can get, I think, is the most important.
Thank you.
Any other questions on the survey?
Would you say this is the first survey surrounding the bond or public survey?
I haven't done one. I'm 6 months fresh, so
Kate?
there was not one.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for your work on that.
Okay, so we're going to move into some of the financial pieces and have Nate, and we are going to sort of chunk it by category, and I think Nate's going to start off with the tax impact, right?
Yep, we're starting off with the tax impact slides. Oh. How's this? Okay, this slide will look familiar to folks. It was part of our presentation last week. I've repeated it here just so that people can see the concrete numbers. But what what follows are 3 slides where we reflect these figures graphically, which was one of the requests that came out of the last meeting. So if we could just advance through those slides, and we won't spend a lot of time on them. We can certainly come back if there are particular questions. But I would just like to kind of advance through. I'm not actually sure who's controlling the presentation. Oh, Carson is. Okay. So let's go, if you can bear with me here for a moment, Carson. Let's just quickly go through the next couple slides in quick succession. Because they're familiar. Again, these are the slides that spell out the particular tax impact on property taxpayers and on income payers are the same as you've seen last time. So if we can just skip through those, and okay, here we go. So this is a new slide. It'll look familiar to a slide that we shared before, but again, just to be clear, this is the percentage change in the tax rate from the current rate using the various assumptions that we've talked about, including 30-year maturity period, and this is the $60 million scenario. A couple features, you can see where the graph peaks. It's fiscal year 2026. It's a little over 10% cumulatively. The BHS bond project on top of the other debt that we would be taking on as part of our capital plan. And then the tax increase eventually actually falls below 0. And again, that's because we're currently paying over $3 million a year in debt service. And so as those payments decline, obviously that would put us in a position where, all else being equal, the tax impact is below today. That's in the future, obviously. We can come back to this slide if necessary, but Carson, if you can quickly skip on to the next 2 and then kind of go back and forth a little bit. People will just see that what's happening here. You can kind of see this low budget animation that there's, the red line's just sliding up and down a little bit. That depends on which scenario that you undertake, the 60 million, the 65, and the 68.5, you can see the shape of that curve remains the same. It's just that the more that you bond for, you get a slightly higher percentage change in the tax rate. So all that information is summarized again on the chart slide that we led off with, but I wanted to respond to a request to display it graphically. I was glad that people liked to see that, because I felt like it was something that helped to illustrate, and we had an internal team debate on whether or not that was valuable use of your time, so I won't let you know who took which side. So anyway, I'm going to pause there and let folks kind of exhaust themselves with questions about the tax impact specifically before we then move on to the questions about what's the budget impact and what's the total indebtedness, just to make sure that everyone feels like they at least understand what these numbers mean and whether there's any other questions related to tax impact.
Yep, Chairwick.
Oh, Nathan, did you say this was 30-year assumption and
Yes.
4%? Thanks.
Yes, correct.
Sorry,
Yep.
I missed that.
I may not have said it, but that's correct.
Commissioner Curry?
Can we get either the general fund dollar amount as a baseline to calculate these percentages on, or can we get the dollar amount that these percentages represent?
I think the answer is yes to both of them. I'm not quite sure what number you're asking for.
Well, you've got a BHS renovation, all debt paid. I mean, maybe you're going to get to it, but I had asked for the total amount of indebtedness now.
Right, so
So
we're
I'd
gonna,
set up, so that's coming.
That's coming.
So you
yeah.
have the dollar amounts and the percentage, and then we can do some calculations from there, right?
I think the answer is yes. Again, if not, we can revisit it, but we
Okay.
do have the total indebtedness section coming up.
Great, thanks.
Commissioner Gorman?
So we have these numbers here that reflect what the tax impact on a $250,000 home is going to be if all of the funding comes from property tax increase. What has to happen to guarantee that all of that money comes from a property tax increase? And if that doesn't happen, I mean, we're talking about more than doubling our liabilities, our loan payments every year. Is there a conceivable scenario in here where that money is not going to come from additional property taxes and is going to come out of the general fund, and all of a sudden, oh, we've got $5 million?
I think I understand your question. So, in fact, the projected impact, whether it's on a property payer or an income payer, those payers are paying their education tax, which technically speaking is a tax of the state. And the state is going to give us, under current law, whatever amount of money we ask for from the state. They don't just give it to us with no impact. The impact is we pay more in taxes to get that money. So under current law, there's no risk that somehow we don't get that money. That's the way the system works, that by design to give us that money. And that money actually is deposited into our general fund, and that's how we pay for it. So to be clear, again, under current law, there's no question of whether or not the state would give us the money. It's a question of how much are they going to charge our ratepayers in order to supply us with that money, which is a function of a variety of variables that we've talked about in the past, but the main one that we control is how much we're spending per pupil.
So the only really functional scenario here is the money comes out of property tax.
Well, again, for example, if the board were to say, we want to engage in a capital campaign where we want to solicit donations, large and small, from whoever we might want to do. If you came up with a creative solution like that and you said, instead of needing, let's say, $60 million, in the end, we only need to borrow 55 because you've raised 5 million of it through an alternative means,
But
that would be
banning
fine.
alternative means.
But other than that,
No bell ringing in the kettle.
right, yeah, I mean, yeah, otherwise, this is like kind of how things are funded as a last resort. There's other options if we have savings in our annual budget that we want to put toward it kind of on as a pay-as-you-go basis.
I think we're good.
Yeah.
Yes, I had a question about the tech center and how upgrades to the tech center might be funded. I know that in the three scenarios that are presented, really the differences are in how much upgrading, or significant differences, how much upgrading we're doing to the tech center. So are there other mechanisms we can use to do upgrades at the tech center through other funding streams other than the education fund? I mean, I just don't know
Not
enough
really,
about
not of this scale. You know, it's not like, again, it would be the same things we talked about. If there's a campaign, one way or another, for them to raise money, and you're doing it kind of saying donate to the tech center as opposed to the school district, if that's more or less palatable or marketable, I don't know. But no, at the end of the day, even the tech center is funded through the education fund by and large.
And can I have one follow-up too? The energy efficiency that we'll see in the new building, is there any rebates or funding that we might be, or, you know, money that we might be able to utilize through energy efficiency programs that would offset some of this? You know, either through direct savings that would offset our debt service, or because, you know, it's like I buy a new water heater, I send in a coupon and the state sends me $200. Is there anything like that that would be available to us?
Potentially, not again at a huge scale probably, although one opportunity that Commissioner Curry brought up at a previous meeting and that we know is potentially out there is to explore, essentially you can figure out how to say this simply. You can, in exchange for providing some of the savings to essentially a third party, you can let them finance your energy investment, your energy efficiency investment. So essentially, it's like they would come in and they would say, okay, great, we will fund you doing this work so that you don't have to ask the taxpayers to do it. And in exchange, we will reap a portion of those savings. So that's something that we can look into further once we actually know kind of what design elements we're going to do here. It may or may not make financial sense, because what you're essentially doing is, right, you're lowering the cost to you today up front, but you are involving a third party who is in it to you know, they have to pay their own bills. And so you're giving away some of those potential future savings in that type of arrangement. So it's definitely not out of the question that it can be explored. And it is an opportunity that can potentially reduce the amount of money that we need to borrow, you know, through the bonding mechanism to do it. I don't have a sense of whether or not it would be a real significant piece of our total package, but it's something that once we kind of know the direction we're going in, our intent is to kind of investigate that further and see if there are opportunities in that vein.
Thank you.
Is there such a thing as an efficiency Vermont for projects of this nature? Like, you know, sorry, yes.
Well, first of all, we don't get funding from Efficiency Vermont because we're outside of Efficiency Vermont's jurisdiction.
Yes.
Right, for
We get
PEDs.
funding from BED, but BED is structured very similar to Efficiency Vermont, and this would be considered like a specialty or a special project, custom project is what they refer to it, and definitely. We have ongoing conversations with them, and we're going to be looking at every avenue to get as many rebates as we possibly can through this project. That may offset, the amount we borrow, but it also may allow us to make upgrades to greater efficient systems without having to borrow more.
And there's no name for it besides it's a arm of Efficiency Vermont, or just so we're knowledgeable of what that is?
No, Liz, you can probably explain that more than me. I apologize, but it's not an arm, it's just two different entities that function the same.
So the State Public Utilities Commission regulates energy efficiency utilities, and they've designated Efficiency Vermont as the energy efficiency utility for the whole state except Burlington. Burlington Electric Department is the energy efficiency utility for Burlington, and Vermont Gas is the energy efficiency energy efficiency utility for gas savings, not electric savings. So what BED has done is to try and create incentives that mirror what Efficiency Vermont does, so that Burlington ratepayers won't be at a disadvantage. And I'd also just like to comment on the energy efficiency bond. The approach there is to use a payback analysis of the efficiency savings. So I just think it's important that we not characterize it as like having pros and cons. It either works or it doesn't. So you're not really giving up those savings because you're actually buying down your debt and your operating costs also. I think there's also an operating cost analysis that's important to talk about, because that relieves our general fund pressures. So it's a bigger conversation. I think it's important to understand it's a payback analysis on the life of the measure, which is often 7, 10, not often 20 years. So after you're done paying back the energy efficiency of the debt, you gain those savings for the rest of the time. So it's not like you're out 30 years the way you are with the general obligation bond.
Yes.
I just wanted to know, what is the difference between the two last, the B and C, I think it is, of the energy savings? How much are you going to save if you did the B scenario as opposed to the C scenario on efficiencies, or whatever you call them, CAT or? No.
Chips, the chips you're talking about?
What?
The chips, you mean?
Chips, yes. What is the difference in those? Why would you do the C one? How much more would you save?
So we cannot quantify how much we're gonna save on scenario A and or
Not A, B,
scenario
and C.
B and C, until we determine whether or not we're gonna provide cooling to the building. The added cooling will increase the overall load to the building, so we're hoping to offset that load by gaining efficiencies in other systems throughout the building. And I think we can kind of dive deeper into that with our mechanical engineer as we further into the presentation here. Yeah.
Commissioner Carter, did you have something?
No, thanks.
Commissioner Webb? Tell me, Nathan, if this is not the right time to ask this question, but it's of a financial nature. I'd like to better understand the alternatives to the property tax increase, or alternatives to just asking the voters for the money that we've explored so far, if any, or is that all to be explored in the future? What have we done to date in exploring alternative funding sources for this project?
Do you want to speak to that, or you want me? I can.
What other alternative funding sources have we
Yeah.
looked at? Is that
Why
what-
why don't they start and then you can jump in?
Yeah, I mean, so, turning the clock back, I don't even know, a few years now, we actually engaged some consultants to help us just explore whether there or not there was kind of a real feasible alternative to take to debt financing for this. The short answer was no. At this scale, there's not kind of another magic bullet out there to use. I think we've talked about, a natural approach that a lot of organizations take if they want to try to do something of this scale, which is to commit to raising some portion of the total project cost through non-tax supported, through sources that are not tax supported, which is a conversation that you folks can have tonight or in the future. But we don't have, we didn't, through that process, the consultants didn't identify any other source would be like, oh, wow, if we just do this, that, the other thing, someone will give us a bunch of money to build this high school or anything. There wasn't anything on that scale. So we've talked, for example, about some of the energy opportunities to get rebates and other things that as we have a clear idea of what the project's going to look like, and we can have that analysis happen and see what we qualify for and all those sort of things. So those opportunities are out there, but again, I think it's just important to keep in mind those aren't paying for the project. Keep the scale of the potential benefits in mind here. There's nothing that was turned up where we said, wow, we should really look at this as a way to pay for a new high school in Burlington.
Marty?
I think the biggest piece is the loss of the school construction aid. There used to be 30% aid where agency in the state of Vermont funded 30% of all building project costs, where there's currently let's hold on all construction aid, and there's no sight as to when that may come back. So I don't think we're in a position that we can continue to hold out to not make these much needed improvements till when that might come back, and if it ever comes back. So that's one of the biggest losses that other districts have had opportunities to help fund their projects that we just currently do not have right now.
And that is something that we've discussed in previous meetings. Those people, I think maybe Jeff, you were at least part of one of them. I can't keep them all straight, but when we've had meetings with the legislative delegation, that topic is perennially comes up in those conversations.
Thanks.
I just want to follow up on that. I spoke with Superintendent Obeng today for the benefit of the rest of the board who, can expand upon that. I think it was an education to me today to find out that funding was allocated and actually contributed by the city for that research to hire a consultant to look for alternative means for funding. And if you could just expand, what you said, and we're talking about like ideally, that it was funded by the city, a portion or all, again, the details are fine, but when this happened, just to get us all up to speed. And
Absolutely, that's critical for the board to understand the background that's going into it. And Marty was part of this process when we engaged a number of consultants, and there was, and Marty may have better memory on this because he wasn't here when the money was dealt out as well too, but there was, I think over $100,000 dedicated to the district to investigate the high school, and the money was used towards looking at our capital and looking at the high school. You want to talk about that?
So there were two pieces, and I don't remember the exact percentage that the city did pay. Not to keep asking for. But we went through two different studies. One where we contracted with Mike Smith and Weithenberg to look at our space constraints and our long-term needs. Through that process, Mike Smith was tasked to seek out alternative funding sources. Some of that study was helped to fund through the city, that they helped contribute funds for that study. And then the other additional study that the city contributed funds for is the EMG study, which simply looked at the assessment of our building conditions. There was not a part of that process that looked at funding available. And Nate, do you remember exactly the amount that the city contributed for both of those?
No, I don't remember. Tens of thousands of dollars, though, for sure.
Seems like 30 is a number.
One of the critical pieces, though, I know Mike Smith and Weittenberg, well, they were selected at the time because they had experience doing projects and doing investigation on alternative funding, and so that was one of the reasons why those entities were tasked in doing that. And reluctantly they came back, and there wasn't really anything major that we could use. So that's when the strategy went to looking at the bond approach. Had we gotten some information around alternative strategies, we certainly would have jumped on it in terms of looking, because at that time we were experiencing severe budget challenges in our district. So there was no impetus to go and ask taxpayers for it. So we were looking very vigorously for alternative strategies, and eventually had to land on this.
I mean, even through that process, looked at options for hypothetically consolidating with other towns.
Like Winooski. Yep.
Correct.
Great. We can follow up. And then with that, do you want to, would now be a good time to just talk briefly about that timeline where we went to the city sort of to educate the board members that weren't privy to those conversations about presenting the overall, after the EMG study and this work, what the grand number was and how we as a board, or the former board, came to the conclusion with the city's input to separate the deferred maintenance and the high school bonding or high school deferred maintenance, because that number as a whole the magnitude of it was digested by the city and the board. Yeah.
So just a little bit of historical, and Nate and Marty can certainly jump in on this. So when, several years ago, I guess it was, and the board started to do the analysis around the capital needs of the district, and we engaged consultants to go and look at every single school, and we're able to come back with our needs and sort of quantify and say, this is the amount that we had to develop the large capital plan and started putting it forward through the board and to the community. At that time, the conversations were that the high school project was so significant, because at that time, we were looking at some large numbers, close to 190 million. It was inclusive of what we were gonna ask for a bond, that it would be more prudent to take it out and spend more time having the conversations. So these are conversations that we have with the mayor's office as well in terms of timing and bonding and what would be the appropriate timing. And so we elected at that point that it was prudent to take that out of the capital plan, and we moved forward with the capital plan with the understanding that we were gonna come back and have a campaign. So we established the community engagement re-envisioning committee, and they spent over a year having conversations around that. Marty and his team worked with the architects and engineers to get the numbers down. I remember the first numbers were around 190 million, and Marty kept sharpening his pencil and going back until we got to something that was livable for us, but we could be comfortable to bring it forward. If people might remember when we presented the capital plan, Liz and Mark and maybe Kathy was around as well too, I think at the time, and I made comments around we're not comfortable bringing forward the high school plan at that point, because we still wanted to do some more investigation around the numbers and around the specifications before we include that, so we took that out. So we intentionally did that, and we had the conversations with the mayor's office around our strategy of taking it out. We had good support around that, and said we'd be coming back in November after we've had some time to build some community input. And we had a number of volunteers, and we have one here, Kate Stein, who's been along the journey a long way, who kind of spearheaded and had the conversations, also been side by side with Marty and the team in talking about the needs of the school and trying to get a site plan that we were comfortable with, but at the same time had a number that we know that we could present and we could stand by and say, yeah, this is the best we can do to meet our needs. I think we had one of the slides, we did a historical back from 2013, and some board members were probably pretty active at that point and were part of the conversations there. So it goes further back, and we just picked it up maybe 3 or 4 years ago and continued the analysis and put forward. So there has been a lot of work, a lot of investigation around. Everyone keeps coming at different entry points, but there's been significant work and analysis that's put forward to it, and that's why we're here now, to try to explain where we are and to have people understand that, this didn't happen over the last month, and to continue to ask the questions so you can feel comfortable as a board in moving forward with something that's going to be good for our students.
Can I add a little detail about the re-envision committee?
Quickly, because we're dragging out. We've got a lot more content to cover here.
So I just wanted to point out, and comment or not, but even through the process of meeting with the re-envision committee, we spent countless hours with our architect John here, getting them up to speed enough so that they could go out there and explain this project to the community.
So are there other questions specifically about the tax impact from folks?
Commissioner Fisher.
So we received a letter from the mayor today. One of the questions was around understanding, it's going to be a difficult question, the discussions around the statewide financing system. And so what are the implications of this as the state looks to change their the system? So from your understanding of the conversations that have been going on, can you predict if there's any implications?
Yes, I can predict that there will be implications. I have no idea what they will be. As we saw last legislative session, I don't think anyone in the legislature or the governor's office can predict with confidence if the system will change, when it will change, or how it will change. If is probably the most likely to say, yeah, it will. But in any significant way. It's completely unclear. We don't know. Anytime you change a financing system, a tax system like that, there are going to be implications that are felt throughout the state, right? Everyone's going to look at how it impacts them. And there's no way we can predict what that will mean for Burlington at this time. What we can say is that a lot of, at least discussion time, was spent on, by the legislature, was devoted toward trying to adjust the system such that the amount taxpayers pay toward education is based more heavily on their incomes as opposed to the value of their property. Whether or not that comes to fruition, we don't know. I've seen clear statements from the chair of the House Ways and Means Committee saying we believe property still has a role to play. I've seen less committal statements from the Senate. Who knows?
But that's all the revenue, on the revenue side, right? Has there been any discussion about carving out capital needs different from operating needs?
In terms of, can you just be a little more specific in your question?
So,
The new formula,
Right,
would there be opportunities for capital investment?
Okay, I got it. Not that I'm aware of specifically. Folks might be interested in knowing that there is currently in law an exclusion from the excess spending penalty threshold for capital debt that gets approved by the Agency of Education. So even though they put a moratorium on state aid for school construction, there remains a process to apply for an exemption from your spending counting toward the excess spending threshold. So if we go through that process, which we would intend to do, we wouldn't have to worry about this increased spending pushing us over the threshold. Now, I will also say, I ran the numbers, at today's threshold, projecting at even our highest spending per pupil resulting from, can I say this out loud, an $80 million scenario, we're still nowhere near over that threshold, spending per pupil threshold, which, by the way, some school districts in the state are above that, just to give you a sense of how much more they happen to be spending per pupil. But anyway, so we are not in any danger with the threshold at its level right now. There is a current exemption in law for capital construction if you go through a little application process. I don't know if any of that will change, but another thing that we talked with Representative Colburn about last year was potentially legislation that would explicitly exclude all capital debt if they were to change the threshold or anything like that.
thank you.
Commissioner Curry?
I would just add that, the legislature went in the direction of shifting to an income-based education tax revenue. But as we know, the governor is putting pressure on reducing the overall tax impact, which, if that were successful and the capital spending is exempt from that, would mean that Burlington taxpayers would benefit from that reduction. So either way, the general direction of either the legislature or the governor would, one, the income base would be presumably more equitable, and it would also, according to some legislators, bring more revenue into the ed fund because people who are earning above a certain amount would actually pay a higher proportion of their income that's equitable. So that would be a good thing to reduce pressure. But if the governor had his way, the overall spending would be lower, so the tax impact would be lower. So I would say overall, we're looking at a good legislative picture if either of those scenarios play out, and there aren't really any other scenarios to look at that are on the table.
Thank you. Can we move to debt service? Good?
Okay, so the next set of slides, again, this chart will look familiar to folks, but this is the annual debt service associated with the BHS renovation at various levels of investment. And then you see the other column as a reminder, that's the other debt that we either currently have or we anticipate taking on in association with the capital improvement plan that we've already passed and have started working on. So I call this annual debt service, but For you folks, it really means what's the impact on the school budget? How much money do we have to budget every year to pay this debt service? Because those funds are competing with every other priority, every other item that we might want to budget to spend money on. So this gives you a sense of how that number peaks out. And then, Carson, if you can move on to the charts. And again, there's 3 charts here. Each of them represents a different total scenario. And Carson, if you want to just do our little animation, you can see the shape is the same. The red number gets a little bit higher. The more you borrow, the more your annual debt service is. And so this is just a graphic illustration, but you can see it really takes a leap up when we do the major portion of the borrowing, which right now we're kind of roughly projecting to be in fiscal year 2022. So we kind of phase in borrowing, and then we would ramp up significantly. And that's where you'd see that. You see the kind of red lines jump up in a big way. And then over time, as we retire debt, that number comes down. So when you see kind of big discrete drops in the red line, it's often actually related to the blue line underneath it. And that's debt that we already have that we are retiring. And that we no longer therefore need to service that debt. So let's just pause here and let folks ask any and all questions related to the budget impact and the debt service.
So is this based on, right now, we have voter approval for a $19 million bond for renovations, right?
Yes.
And then is this just adding a 60, 65, or 68? Or does this include the $2 million a year?
This includes the total capital plan estimate, so the $39 million, that's the $19 million voter approved over 10 years, plus the $2 million a year over that same 10 years. You add the 19 and the 10 years times $2 million together, you get $39 million. That's all incorporated into these projections.
So the $2 million per year, though, is that programmed?
It's not specifically programmed at this time. That's the amount of charter authorized bonding that we don't need to go to the voters for every year. And that is kind of like the first money we would tap into for every year of planned capital work that we do, right? So, for example, this past year, we borrowed $2.3 million to spend on the capital plan. The first $2 million is like that authorized $2 million by charter, and the other $300,000 is from the $19 million.
No, I get that. I guess that's a question for Marty. We had programmed the $19 million for specific renovations.
Oh, yeah.
Then we have access to an annual $2 million that was not programmed. It was going to support our pre-K expansion that we need. So now that we're not expanding pre-K,
No, I wouldn't say it.
where's the $2 million going?
I guess I wouldn't say it that way. I mean, the $2 million per year was part of the $39 million
I
plan,
get that.
which included
But-
the pre-K portion. And I think
Okay.
the question of what we do about that is yet to be answered.
Okay.
But I wouldn't say that the answer is we do nothing.
Okay, so the but I guess I would just like more of an analysis, because if the 19 million program that we have line items for gave us solutions that are needed from Mike Smith and David White's capital plan, that's all programmed for like EMS and IAA and, right? Then we have this 2 million a year. So I'd like to understand how that will be programmed. Maybe it's the pre-K, so maybe we need 2 years of it for pre-K, but then after that, we still get it every year. So does that mean it's offsetting the 19 million? Does that mean there's additional needs? Does that mean it's offsetting the 60 million? I just want to understand.
Where it can
It's
go,
stranded
yeah.
right now, and it needs an answer, you know, to where the need is.
Still identified $39 million worth of need.
Yeah.
But some of that was the pre-K.
Yeah, so yes, we are looking at alternatives, how to meet our pre-K needs. It may not necessarily be the kind of rebuild that we had formerly. You want to know what's going to happen with those dollars that we were planning to allocate for that program.
Well, I guess you just kind of answered my question. We had a program for 39 million.
Right.
And that was, I'll have to go back and look at it, but that should be like kind of part of the, I think, the total documentation with this slide so that we understand.
It's embedded in that, if you go back to the chart.
Right, but I think
Carson, if
that
you just-
line item,
Carson, if you just
one
flip
you
over
had.
to Last week's presentation, I think it's probably like the second slide.
Okay, Yeah, because you had like a chart of everything
Okay,
that,
you good with that?
yeah.
And I think we have it when we look at the
Yeah.
document that was put out. So Ira Allen speaks to the 3.2 million, and Ira Allen was originally pre-K. So, you know, we have allotted in that breakdown what you're asking for.
And what presentation was that?
Been a number of them, but
I- 'cause I
One of the
missed-
last 2 or 3 years.
Oh, okay, I think I missed the August
Might
one, that's
have
why.
been the one before last.
In on, yeah, I think I missed one,
Yeah, maybe a
okay.
week you're away.
Got it, thanks.
Commissioner Wick?
Nathan, go into that bar chart showing the
Nope.
years.
Could you advance, Carson? Thanks.
Yeah. How sensitive are the height of those bars to interest rates and changing? And also the 20 versus 30-year bonding decision, which I think you mentioned is not going to be up to us, it's going to be up to the city of Burlington. So I'm just wondering that if there's, I wouldn't expect you to do that tonight, but maybe a sensitivity analysis is in order for those 2 factors?
Yeah, I actually probably can, with the benefit of a few minutes, give you at least a sense. I'm trying to look back through, because remember, I originally did some estimates at 20 years. So for example, I can tell you, with the benefit of a little bit of time, I could tell you tonight, what was the peak debt service if we assumed a 20-year bond versus a 30-year bond? And there is a difference in the annual impact. I'm just kind of looking through here, and
We have those slides, actually.
okay, if you have them, yeah, we can put them up, but
But-
that'll give you a rough sense of like that scale. I forget what the exact number is, but it's out there.
And perhaps more important to me, maybe not more important, is what is the change in the height of those bars for, say, a 1% change in the interest rate, or a 2% change in the interest rate that we're expecting? And, I mean, and I'm not asking for answers, I just think it's important that we realize, that we know this. You know, what's the probability of maybe we don't know, but of a 1% rise or a 2% rise? I mean, how confident are we in these estimates? I guess is ultimately the question, and then what are the, what are the changes that we should be aware of that could happen?
I think you spoke on this before, Nate, in terms of the assumptions you used around the 4%.
Right.
You had some, go ahead.
Yeah, we did, so you're right, I mean, I can work up some other simple scenarios, and yeah, we might have some of it already, but I did have a conversation with Rich Goodwin at the City of Burlington, just talking to him about what is a reasonable number to use. He knew kind of approximately when we would envision borrowing. Nobody knows exactly what's going to happen to interest rates, obviously, but he said, hey, when I'm doing analysis right now at these types of terms, I'm looking at a 3.75 to a 4.25% range. He said, I'm usually using about 4 as his number. So he felt like that was a safe number to use, but I can certainly do a few calculations at, a 5% number and just see what it looks like.
Or
That
even
can be
ask
done.
Rich if 5%'s absurd, or is
Right.
that still within reason?
Yeah, I mean, who's to say for sure, right? It's,
Right.
I don't know if I'd want to put him on the spot with that question.
Okay, fair enough.
All right.
Okay, so this was, we just talked about the budget impact. One thing we didn't talk about last week that we just but we talked about the prior small group meetings, that you might remember, is just what does this look like in terms of total district debt? Which doesn't, you don't feel that on an annual basis in your budget directly, you feel it indirectly through the amount of debt service you're paying. But it's still important to know what this is, and it's important because the city has talked about a desire to craft a debt policy that would incorporate potentially the school district's debt in terms of whatever the city's limit is. So it's important just to have an understanding of where we would be as a school district, because it's potentially of interest to the city when we present to them as well. So I wanted you folks to see this. Again, there is a chart here that shows the figures. We talked about this at the last meeting, but we didn't actually have a chart for it, I don't believe. So I did the same kind of chart here. And you can see that the BHS renovation column increases depending on how much you borrow, as you would expect. The other debt column is a steady number. Again, this is at its peak, so you can kind of see the high points here. This is not all the time, and we'll see that in the charts. But you can see that the range is roughly 110 to 118 million of of total debt when you kind of roll it all in together and count it. And then if, Carson, if you could go on and just show the charts. So this is what I was talking about where I was saying I'm illustrating the peak there. So you can see like the worst case portion of these scenarios. The shape, again, of these curves, there's 3 graphs here. They all look the same, except that the more you borrow, the higher that number goes. But you can see, again, it jumps up significantly when we take on the bulk of the BHS bonding, no matter what amount that's going to be. And then you start paying that debt off, and you do that over the next 30 years until you've retired it down to nothing. And so you can see there's just a kind of steady decline there. The only real precipitous drop you see, which is in, I believe, fiscal 26 there, is because we do have a couple of bonds that are interest-only bonds, so we're only paying the bondholders' interest. We're not repaying any of the principal right now, and then we're going to have to pay them something like $11 million that year. However, every year we're budgeting for and setting aside money in a sinking fund so that we're not going to be surprised with an $11 million bill. We're going to have that money, and we're going to, by the way, have the benefit of a small amount of interest that we've accrued over the course of the years by continuing to invest in that. So another possibility, for example, with one-time funds that we may have available to kind of reduce our future costs is to invest those one-time funds into that sinking fund so that we can reduce the amount we have to borrow, budget for it on an annual basis. That's conversation for another night, but the point is that's why you see the number jump up. We borrow for BHS. You see one significant drop when we pay back those 2 bonds, and then for the most part, otherwise, you see a relatively steady decline in indebtedness as we pay back the borrowing. So any questions about the total debt load of the district, what it means, how much it is, anything of that nature?
So does the 50.7 million, does that include the 39 million?
Yes.
But
Yes, it
even
does.
though we haven't really spent the 39 million.
These were projections, and so I assumed that we go through with that plan and that we fully borrow all the 39 million to do that work. And so that's incorporated into that peak of $50.7 million.
Okay, so then there's like 10 or 11 million.
Interest.
No, that's addition. So in addition to that 39 million, we have the turf field out here, the work that you've seen at Flynn, all that stuff that money was borrowed to do that work. Those are bonds that currently exist that we're paying off over time. And so there's that kind of base debt load onto which we have our capital plan and then potentially the high school. And so the base debt load and the capital plan, that's in the other debt column there. Those 2 numbers combined at a peak represent about $50.7 million in debt based on just a projection of when we would do the borrowing over the next 10 years on the capital plan.
Okay, so the debt we have until now, except for the 39 million, is about 11 million.
No,
Not
that's not actually
29.
true right now, and I think the subtle difference in the way you're saying it is the $39 million, folks should understand that we have authority to borrow that. We haven't borrowed that. We've actually only borrowed $2.3 million worth of that total $39 million plan. So we have authority to go out and do that, but we haven't actually, so that's not on our current debt load. But we do have a current debt load, and that is in one of our previous slides. I can pull it up, and it's in our audit every year of kind of what our current debt is, and I can find the number so I give it to you exactly later. But it's actually more than 11 million, but remember, every year you're also paying some of that down. So as you're potentially borrowing more for your capital debt program, you're also paying down some of that older debt every year.
I think at the end of the day, I think your question is around the analysis there is assuming we're borrowing all the money we have authority to borrow, which we haven't yet. We're not even close to that. But if we did, then this is what it would look like.
Yeah, it's just that at one of our smaller meetings, you said currently we already owe 29 million.
Yeah,
So
that's
29 plus 39 isn't 50, but.
You're right. And so that's what I'm saying. So it's somewhere in that $29 million range. Good memory. But so what's happening is we've got that debt. If we did nothing, if we borrowed nothing for any reason going forward, right, that $29 million is going to creep down every year as we repay some of that debt. What I did was look at that number and then add on to it the number that will increase our debt over time, which is additional borrowing for the capital plan. So I've factored both of those numbers in. One of those numbers starts at 29 and starts going down. Another one of those starts at 0 and starts going up. But of course, this year we borrowed $2.3 million. Next year, we won't have that $2.3 million fully outstanding. We will repay some of it, but we'll borrow more. So you've got factors pushing the number up and down each year, and when you combine them, you get a peak of 50.7 million.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
Question.
Commissioner Rock.
Nathan, is there anyone who can give us advice on how much is a healthy debt load for a school district and how much is too much?
I don't know if, I mean, there's probably people who and we talked about this once, and I actually did a little Googling, and I saw a variety of results, and I was frankly surprised at how high some of the numbers were, and I was like, oh, this makes our proposals look a lot more palatable than I would have imagined. But I don't actually know if there's some kind of a standard, and it's hard to evaluate, again, some of the impacts in other states, because at the end of the day, it's what can you afford, right? And that's kind of a judgment that you make. It's to some degree political, but it's also like the various different ways that states fund their education, the types of support they get for capital makes it pretty tough. So I don't know if you've Googled any more than I did that first night. You might find some metrics out there, but I didn't find anything where I said, well, this is it. This gives us our answer.
Thanks.
So I believe our auditor audits other school districts in Vermont, and so could probably provide some ratios. He also audits school districts in other northern New England states. He could probably provide some ratios, but again, that doesn't mean the education funding system is the same. So, but I think it's worth asking him, you know, for industry ratios.
Thank you.
Last one.
All right, the exciting part's over.
Thank you, Nate.
All right, so now we're gonna get into the building side. We've kind of been popcorning into that a little bit around site stuff, but we've got our engineers and architects here, and consultants to ask some questions around those particulars that I know people are interested in. So I'll let Marty start off. And
So-
then, do you want to introduce the panel first?
So I'm going to introduce John Hemmelgarn from Black River Design, and I'm going to let John introduce his consultants here.
Hello. So now we get to talk about some really interesting stuff. I wanted to say one thing right off for Nate, is that I've heard a lot of business managers describe some of those tax issues and some of those school funding concepts before, but I'm not sure I've ever heard anyone do it quite so clearly and concisely as what I just heard Nate do. So thank you, Nate. Well done.
Couldn't agree more.
Yeah. So I'm glad to be here, and I want to introduce this team here because to date, I know you've seen a lot of Marty and a little of me and not many other people, but there are a lot of people that have been working on this. I've got Jeff Hodgson from Wagner Hodgson, landscape architects, Bob Neild from Engineering Ventures, structural engineering. So I got to see who's next. Bill Nettie from Krebs and Lansing, a civil engineering firm. And finally, on the end is George Martin from LN Consulting, and they do all the, what we call MEP, mechanical, electrical, plumbing, which is a huge umbrella on this project. In addition, there are other people. I just want to let you know that. I mean, from my office, there's Polly, there's Megan, there's Jim, there's Mark. You know, Hannah works for Jeff, you know, Ian and Paul and John down at the other end of the table, or Tim at Bill's office. I mean, there are a lot of people that have been working on this. So there's a lot of information here. There's a lot of experience here doing school buildings. So I just wanted to let you know that. So if you have questions, I think we can handle them. And I think, you know, really, I think that's where we want to be, is to just we're here to respond to your questions or what you don't understand or don't know or need to know about the construction process in general or about this project in specific.
I think we were going to start out with the design and site plan. So where we are today on this, you know, why we chose the design, the site plan, the challenges of the site plan, and what is, you know, again, when we think of this budget number, where are your biggest costs associated in choosing, or how did you deliver the site plan because of, you know, limitations on funds or that?
All right. Can we pull up a site plan, I guess?
So
Thank you.
The, well, you guys are gonna go right at it, huh? No, this is a challenging site plan. We knew that going in. You know,
Yep, right there.
to make a renovation project work, it usually does stress the site a little bit. It means we have to actually do some design work. This isn't the flat area along the interstate there in Williston where we just plopped a bunch of boxes on empty lots and put a bunch of parking around it. You know, we have to be careful of how we do this, and we have to think about it. As I said the other night, water runs downhill. Stormwater is an important factor on this site design. So that's why you see the parking pushed up the hill. We have, and that's a major cost driver on the site work costs that we have going on here. We've also got costs for kind of relocating underground utilities. Moving the parking up the hill requires some ledge removal. I know some people have asked about that. We've had a geotech firm out here. It's either Sanborn Head or Head and Sanborn, I can't remember.
Sanborn Head.
Thank you. Anyway, they have gotten back to me and said, no, there's absolutely nothing here that means we can't remove that ledge there. It's relatively close to some of the buildings here, but that doesn't bother them a bit with the pre-drilling that they can do. We've gotten budget numbers from them, so we built into this price, and that's one of the bigger numbers here. Obviously, it costs a lot to put driveways and parking lots and whatnot in and to repave the student parking lot on the other side of the road. You know, those are all things that we've taken into consideration here. Another big issue is traffic flow on this site. The idea that, you know, the education department has forever dictated that we separate bus traffic from the parents who are dropping off kids, or in this case, you've got students driving, which is probably even a bigger conflict, or students leaving the school site after school, which is probably the most dangerous thing I ever see on high school sites. So we've got separate loops. We did look at the possibility of trying to bring the bus loop in off of Institute Road, but as you know, there's a grade change in there. It goes downhill quite a bit. You can see it if you just go out in the parking lot and look at the parking lot. So what we've got is we're trying to keep things at a relatively flat elevation to the extent possible where the buses are going to be, trying to get some of the drives going with the contours. At the same time, Bill's done a great job of trying to find places where we can create hollows in there to treat the stormwater. So I think these guys have done a great job of coordinating between what Bob needs for founding the building on the ledge that's out there with what Bill needs to treat our stormwater. What Jeff does, which is a great job of putting some landscaping and outdoor gathering spaces on the site, which we also have, one by the front door and also in the courtyard that you see there. We've also got it designed so that from that upper parking lot, you'll actually have an entrance up through the top of B building that'll trickle right down to a new elevator there to get you down to the lobby from that upper parking lot, which will allow people to park up there and still have easy access into the common spaces in the building, such as the gymnasium and the auditorium. So it's a very complex site plan. At the same time, well, you can see that we're bounded by trees there on the top, right? And by the existing drives and the property lines on the west towards the lake. We were really trying hard. We heard when we were looking at new building options of not disturbing the ball fields and the athletic fields, certainly not the turf field that's there. You've got one of the premier facilities in the state in that respect, and we're not going to mess with that. So there were some challenges that I would say to you, but I think that we have spent some time and some effort and really tried to come up with something here where we're not having a lot of students getting off buses, walking across driveways. There's one drive that they have to cross, and there'll be a giant crosswalk there. We'll probably change the paving right there so that it really looks like something different. We're going to try to slow the traffic down right there. Anyway, I'm sorry, I get excited talking about this. But.
Can I just add a little detail? Some of the design components that were built into this overall design, which came from feedback from our staff and stakeholders around One area was staff would like to have level parking spots and not park on the side of a hill. Another option was to create a more of a facade to the front of the building off of North Avenue, so we don't just have this sea of parking lot of cars at the front entrance. Another factor was, actually came from the fire marshal, was around having a proper drop-off that is not in our current fire lane. So working those design components around the challenges of stormwater, of ledge, of all the other components that come with this site, kind of led us to this final design. One other particular detail that I just want to also add, and it's relevant to the discussion about e-building. We also have to work within our current lot coverage. So based on the proposed additional building and the proposed additional asphalt that we'll be adding with this site, we cannot exceed what our current lot coverage is. So we've done the math, we've done the calculations of once we demolish A, B, and C buildings, we meet that lot coverage requirement for our zoning. If we exceed that lot coverage, if let's say we propose to keep E building as an option for this project in the future, we'll then be required to go through zoning to either get a variance or actually what zoning would like us to do is to redistrict this site because we're currently zoned as recreational. So it would actually make more sense for the zoning to create a specific district specific for educational use. So that is something we can certainly look at a process that we can look at going through, but if we decide to use e-building, but right now our focus is around keeping our existing lot coverage the same.
Just to educate the board, when we talk about swing space, so those, during this construction of the main building, we'll call, that surrounds the auditorium, as that's being built, classes are in session in the existing buildings. And so at the same time, we're building, we're increasing our footprint. There's an understanding that we're still occupying a larger footprint, but that the demolition is inevitable for that. So
Yes.
in order to build that building, you have to demolish those three.
Correct.
Okay, all right.
I like to think of that as collateral benefits here.
Yes, without a doubt. Yeah, but I just wanted, so people knew that's what would be, if you hadn't read up on it. And then for Mr. Wagner, the gentleman for Wagner, the landscape architect. So when we talk about the value of moving the faculty parking lot, which is now where it is, it's an aesthetic for the points that you just talked about. So, if there was an area that we could determine or look at, a cost, something that is extremely expensive, or that we wanted to analyze and look further, the building scope and the size and shape of everything, parking aside, separating those costs, that we could look at if the existing faculty parking lot stayed as is. That is something that the new building doesn't require that land or those water, stormwater, just adding, again.
More of a Bill question, but it's
Yeah,
something to point out.
I'm going to invite these guys to tell me to shut up and answer the question for me when I need to. But again, what I've been saying is that water runs downhill. So really, we can't keep it there because you can't put the stormwater treatment up above because you're treating the water that's coming off of those impervious surfaces.
And just to add, also the new building expansion does go out over that parking lot, the existing parking lot, and a little bit.
Right.
But it couldn't just remain as is.
Right.
And the new parking lot on the upper part of the site is completely accessible across the whole parking lot, so it never exceeds 1 in 20 slope. So it's a big upgrade for accessibility.
Commissioner Alwa.
So, I have two questions. Does the parking lot have as many spaces as the one now? That's very small to me.
Kathy, if you can speak into the microphone.
Oh, sorry. Does the parking lot have as many spaces as the present one does? It looks a lot smaller to me.
Overall, we've added about 40 spaces.
Oh, okay. And then the other question I had was,
And that-
are those kind of bluish areas there water, like ponds?
Bill, that one's yours.
It's yours.
Only when it's raining.
Right.
Only when it rains really hard.
Bill Meddy, Curbs and Landscape Consulting Engineers. At this point, we're looking at gravel wetlands, and I can go, it's called a gravel wetland. And what that is it's essentially a stormwater pond filled with stone. So the initial lower level storms, the lower intensity storms, fill up the voids in the stone. And then it's only the larger events, storm events, with the water actually pond in those ponds so that you see it. So that's how the stormwater pond works.
Most of the time you would see kind of tall grass, so.
Okay, it's not the site, I'm more worried about, these are kids. And you have open water.
Right. The challenge is we have to do something on the site to treat the stormwater, and we have to work within the means of the site to do something like this somewhere, and it has to be in a location where that water's gonna flow to. So you probably don't even see it, but we have a little pond like this right next to our track across the street. Currently, correct.
And we do have some talented people here that are going to minimize the visual impact of that. So whether it's a straight up fence or whether there's some planting or some combination of the two that is going to look consistent with the rest of the building design, I'm sure we'll do something there.
Yeah.
But clearly, I think I heard from your gravel wetlands, it's not a pond 100% of the time. It's only a potential pond when there's extreme water that needs to be wasted away, correct?
That's correct. So during a small storm event, the voids in the stone underneath the grass surface will fill up, and there won't be any ponding at all for the small storm events.
John, we talked a couple minutes ago about the extensive work needed to, I don't know if you call it prepare the site or move the parking lot, the blasting, that sort. Is there any way you could give us a brief overview, almost like a pie chart or a stacked bar that tells us how much of this 68 million is sort of just mandatory this and that versus how much of it is the icing on the cake that we can vary to our tastes?
I think about, when I looked at kind of what the $60 million project gets in the 65 or 68, I dropped the site work about $200,000 is all. On the site work is, there's not a lot of variation in there. We can change maybe the finished materials on the retaining walls, which we've pretty much gotten rid of because of the ledge is in the back there is going to function as that. But it's a very small amount. It may be what's out of 200,000 out of 2 million is 10%, so it's less than 10%.
So if the site work is 2 million, and that's pretty much not very variable.
It's more than that, about 2.5 or more.
2.5. Where do we get the tens of millions? Where does that really come from?
For the whole project?
Yeah.
It comes from the new construction, it comes from the renovations, it comes from all the different building systems that go into this. You know, the other thing that is involved here, and I was thought of this as Nate was speaking, when you were talking about the variables and they can't predict what the interest rate's going to be. Well, we're trying to predict what construction costs are going to be a year and a half or 2 years in the future with an unknown workforce availability and unknown tariffs that seem to be appearing and disappearing on a weekly basis. So we're doing the best we can to project these costs. And the last thing you want to do is have not enough money to do a good job. So we're trying to be as accurate as we can, but rubbing 3 or 4 different crystal balls at the same time and combining them in there. So it's, these are all reasonable amounts, and it's based on what our experience has been, the experience of my cost estimator. I've talked to each of these guys about the cost of their systems, and we're wanting to put something in front of you that we're comfortable and confident that we can actually accomplish this project with all those variables that are out there. It's not very easy.
If you look at the last slide deck that we had, there is a slide in there that has a budget laid out. So that gives you a little bit of information where to break down of different categories, how much is allocated to some of the different categories. So you can refer to that, it'll give you some more detail.
Right, and John has a very detailed itemized cost spreadsheet that, kind of like working with Nate's spreadsheets, you would need to sit down with him to understand the levels of different tabs that kind of funnel into that, so that you would have that greater understanding of where those numbers all come from. But the spreadsheet that Yao mentioned just gives a broader description of the breakdown of each component per square foot cost.
Thank you, Marty.
Commissioner Curry?
So I'm stuck on traffic circulation and pavement and this many road entrances, curb cuts and whatnot. So my question is, right now we have a really terrible traffic pattern and we're not doing anything to make it better. So I have like a series of questions. Have you talked with the city? There was a proposal floating around for a rotary instead of a traffic light. If we have to keep this configuration, can we get a better traffic signal schedule, timing? And I just think it's really problematic right now, the way the traffic flows in the morning for everybody as a major commuter route and with the bus turnoff. So I'm wondering if you could tell us how many, like we have the upper lot and the lower lot, and it was really good information to hear that AOE prevents us from mixing student and bus traffic. So could we switch this, parking, like designated parking for students in the upper lot and put the teachers across the street so that the buses could come in and use the upper lot to circulate it? I'm talking about the place you can't even see on the south side of the site. Could we play around with the circulation on the south side of the site to get rid of this cutoff, and then make this better? Like, it just would be nice if it were, just directly across from this one and just went up and over, and then we'd have less pavement, and then you could use this lot for the bus, would come in and drop off and go back. And I understand accessibility is an issue, so that would have to be thought about, but I'm just, wondering about playing with fewer curb cuts, better traffic circulation, less pavement, and reassigning usage.
Those are all things that we'd love to do. We like to think about those things. I always like to think that improvements are always welcome. I don't like that. The improvements are always welcome. There are even more constraints than I mentioned before on there. That exit from the student parking lot, for example, that shows up on all of our plans actually has a couple giant concrete blocks in front of it, and it's blocked off. And I've never had anybody explain to me why, but I can only imagine that that they don't want people coming out of there because it blocks up traffic that's queuing for the traffic light. And so we needed to keep I would much rather have had our entrance to our drop-off loop closer to North Avenue. But I really didn't think that was going to be very viable because of the need to stack traffic. And again, I'm venturing outside of my area of expertise, and I'm not even sure if I'm within Bill's area of expertise on traffic. Right. So those are all things. But having said that, we wanted to put something out that we knew would work and that was viable because, as you say, the bad news is that it doesn't fix anything. The good news is that it doesn't change much. In terms of how you get on and off of North Avenue. And so therefore, you end up with a grandfathered type of situation, which is good and bad. And I would agree with you that there are things here that are less than ideal. We did think briefly about finding another site somewhere in the city, but we weren't going to do that. And so we're kind of stuck with this site.
Yeah, no, I guess my question is, when is the appropriate time to talk with the city about the traffic circulation, since it has been on DPW's list of problematic configurations?
I think, the interesting thing here is that we put a proposal in to do this work 4.5 years ago. And we did it in a very competitive environment with other firms, and we put in a price to do what we think you asked for and what you wanted. But we can't do the entire design process, and so you have to kind of draw a line somewhere.
No, I understand that. My question is, when you're developing in the city, typically, when do you go have traffic conversations with the city? Is it, when you're submitting your permit? Is it before that? When is the technical review committee? When is the time when the city can look at this and say, oh, we can work with you on solving this issue?
Typically, that's done through TRC.
Okay.
And TRC is usually.
After you submit.
Yeah,
do what?
simultaneously at the same time that you're submitting.
So could we ask for a meeting
Absolutely. yes.
sooner
I can
rather
have-
than
I can have
later
ongoing
to
discussions.
get their input and their
about that with the
feedback
city. Yep,
specifically?
right. Yep.
Thank you.
And I definitely envision that post-bond design will involve a traffic study
Right, but
consultant.
it would be
Yep,
nice
yep.
to know that there's a partnership to resolve this, which is a huge glaring, wart on the whole plan. Thanks.
Thank you. So, site plan, Commissioner Barlow?
John, you had said that you were also trying to prognosticate on costs, and I was wondering to what extent, if any, does some of the downtown redevelopment put cost pressures or resource pressures on this project, and is that something, or are they different kinds of construction that?
I think that that's something that concerns everyone over here on this side of the table. I'm sure it's concerning Marty as well. I think even this summer, we're starting to see some of that crop up. I can tell you that, that isn't affecting in some ways what I'm projecting here for costs as well, because there's only so many tradespeople here. We got to start cranking them out of the tech centers here or something. But it's a real concern. It is a real concern, and this project would add to that. There's no doubt. I mean, $50 or $60 million projects are not a dime a dozen in Vermont.
Thank you. Commissioner Carey?
Just a quick question about recycling in terms of the demolition of the buildings that are here. Is there any plan to reuse some of the materials or sell it, or is that part of the plan?
I think we are, well, for one thing, I think we'll be required to separate a lot of the stuff out of there. We will get into that. I've done that on other projects where you take some of the pieces, you can set them aside. Sometimes there's community members that want them. Sometimes there's places that will buy those things. There are a lot of options, and like if you're doing a LEED project, it's actually required. And I'm not sure if there's a point
There
in
was a
chips
point
or
in
not for
chips,
that,
yep.
but I think there is. So I think we would certainly be looking at that, and within the budget that we have and the effort that's involved, we would be looking at that as a real possibility. I like doing that. I think it's an extremely sustainable component of a project.
Can I just follow up on that? The reason I ask is that I was really impressed at that information that came out with the development of the City Place space, how everything was reused, recycled. It was really an impressive selling point from my perspective. That's why I asked.
Commissioner Wood?
Is the structure steel-based or is it wood-based?
Oh, we got your question.
It will be steel and concrete, steel frame with steel and concrete floors.
So very long-lived.
What's that?
Yes.
Very long-lived.
Yes, oh yeah.
That stuff lasts.
Without a doubt. A lot of masonry, a lot of steel.
I mean, it's similar to what's in these buildings now, and they're still standing there pretty solidly. I mean, they're also founded on the ledge that's underneath here,
Yeah,
so.
it sounds good.
That sounds like a Three Pigs question. Did you make it out of hay? Did you make it out of?
Commissioner Fisher?
So actually, that came up in a discussion. So what is the anticipated lifespan of the building? What kind of, when we're done renovating?
Well, the structure is gonna have one lifespan. George, how long are your mechanical systems gonna last?
Depends what we choose, but 20 to 30 years, depending on.
So I'm sorry, not the mechanical, I understand those
Right, but-
moving parts,
but-
but the infrastructure, the bones of the.
Again, and those all vary. The building structure is gonna stand there for a long time. The roof is gonna last less. The flooring is gonna last even less Well, yeah, probably less than the roof. So, you know, the
Less
paint needs to be
asbestos.
redone even, you know, really Marty's got that EMG report that kind of goes over what each component of the building is going to do. Now, we do get choices at times, and, you know, flooring is one of the really good examples of that. You can do one kind of floor like you've got in here that lasts a certain period of time but takes a lot of maintenance. Others will last longer and take less maintenance but cost more. So we're looking, and that was kind of one of the differences between the A option and then the B and C options that we were looking at, so.
I mean, are we talking like a difference of 50 years between A and C for the building to last? I mean, I'm talking about the infrastructure, I'm talking about the, you know, the foundations, the structure, the walls.
The foundations are gonna last, you know,
50 to 100 years.
50 to 100 years. I mean, these ones here are 50-some years old now, and they're still, they've, what we used to say about carpet, they've kind of uglied out.
Thank you. Can you speak to the square footage? What drove giving John and his team what we have? And again, just a quick re-education to the board and the public on square footage now, where we directed.
I wanted to just say one thing is, my civil engineer needs to leave, so if you have any more site questions for him, I'm sorry to interrupt you there, but I just want to make sure everybody gets the questions answered that are out there.
Commissioner Curry?
I had in my notes an elevated boardwalk, and I lost track of that. Is that blue thing that goes across from the teardrop?
No, it's actually on the south side of the building. There's quite a bit of grade change from the exit door to the roadway.
I don't have my.
And so what we envisioned was, and we're using that area as one of the gravel wetland areas. So it was just an idea of having a boardwalk over the gravel wetland. So it's.
Where the music department is?
Yeah,
The
kind of down at the
existing-
bottom there.
Right there.
Yeah, right there where the,
To the
yes,
right.
very good. Just to the right of that.
That, at the end of that parking area?
So that you can get from the student parking lot over to the on-top entrance or to the gym entrance there. We're really trying to maximize how much space we're using for, well, we need to use as much of the site as we can for the stormwater management. As we get into the absolute details, if we can reduce that area, we will. But right now, we need to propose something we know is gonna work.
So is that just made out of pressure treated wood or something? Or is it steel?
I'm sorry,
What's the material?
I mean, we haven't gotten that far. It's really just to say it's an elevated walkway right now, so we would have to figure that out in the details.
But it's kind of like detached,
It's not gonna be
floating.
painted wood. That
No,
needs a
but
lot
I
of
mean, it's
maintenance.
not like structural, right? I mean, it's structural, but it's not, it's like floating attached to something that's in the ground, or,
Probably on
Like in-
piers.
okay, thanks.
So before Mr. Nettie leaves, is there any question we should be asking you that you have to be avoided?
Reverse this. Very quickly, again, when we attack the stormwater design, our first priority is to look for infiltration, and obviously the site here does not promote infiltration of stormwater very well. So we've designed the most cost-effective, efficient stormwater system that the state allows as part of going through that state stormwater permit process, which the project will go through. So it's very, very innovative, and I think that's pretty much it.
Is this a challenging project to you in your field, this property site?
It's
Yes, to
very,
your
it's
point.
very challenging, so
Can you give
certainly.
us, again, it's sort of like, how'd you do on the test, like, what other schools have you worked on? Or just give us an example, because I do think it helps in a small state for us to, we've attached Marty to Lamoille and that,
Well, I think
renovation retrofit.
Stormwater is specifically a challenge here in the sense that there's not a central treatment area. We've done a number of schools, and not the typical, but most have lands sufficient downstream to isolate the stormwater treatment systems more than the Burlington High School has. So,
City
so I-
living.
So, yeah, and with that, I think we've had to dissect the stormwater systems into multiple areas, which are less efficient, but, just with the amount of room we've had, we have sufficient room now, but barely.
And last question, when we look at this site now, how, in this current state, is this property addressing stormwater? Is it efficient in its,
The current state today.
right?
Now, you have a lot of impervious that really has no treatment at all. So, yeah, so the whole north side of Institute Road, there's really no stormwater treatment in the current site. So this actually will, certainly help. It'll help the discharge from the school's property, clearly. Especially from all the new impervious will be fully treated according to the state stormwater rules. And that'll make a good impact for the downstream discharge.
Thank you for staying a little extra. One last question for Commissioner Olwell.
Have we looked, I don't know whether it's proposed or not, but at green roofs on this huge expanse so that it holds the water and something's growing up there and it cools the building at the same time?
We have looked at that option. That's in our $80 million scenario, or actually our $74 million scenario. Yeah, 78, correct. Yeah.
It's in the 7 million.
It is.
78 million.
78.
78 million.
78 million.
Great, thank you.
Well, in the long run, it keeps the building cooler and it takes up a lot of that stormwater you're talking.
Thank you.
Can I just ask one more detail, Bill? Just the threshold of needing a state stormwater permit versus not needing a state stormwater permit, and that may answer some of the questions, how some schools may not have as significant of a design because they may not have to meet those thresholds.
Well, the state stormwater threshold is 1 acre of impervious, so depending on, how much existing infrastructure you have, you're only required to treat the new impervious areas. So other existing impervious is grandfathered, and so that's the threshold for requiring a state permit to any new impervious area over 1 acre.
Bill, just one more. Bill, thank you very much for taking the time. I know it's, you have family time and things to do, but thank you for spending the time, so.
I think he
we'll
actually
let
has
you go.
another meeting tonight.
Yeah, we'll let you go.
Next meeting. All right, moving on. So scope of the project, sort of, again, commissioners, we're talking about enhancements. We had our presentation last week with John. Are there any questions surrounding enhancements that we know already, and most importantly, our accessibility, energy, safety? We can talk about those things in the broader context. Commissioner Curry?
I thought you had asked about square footage requirements, but we
Oh,
jumped to stormwater. So
We did.
can we go back
Thank
to
you,
square
Commissioner
footage
Curry.
requirements?
Thank
Yeah.
you.
What was the repeat?
Current square foot of the.
240, yes, I do remember.
Thank you,
the question.
thank you,
We're
Commissioner
currently
Curry.
245,000 square feet. Our proposal is for 280,000 square feet. Some of the driver of that additional square footage came from the feedback that we received from staff, such as additional PE support, additional theater support, additional cafeteria space, additional conference rooms, et cetera. So the bulk of that additional square footage is not in classroom instruction space. We're not actually adding adding classrooms to the project. We are probably increasing the size of many of those classrooms. What we're really doing is making them more consistent in size so that there's not a huge variation. So that's where some of the drivers of the additional square footage, and then John, maybe you can just talk about the programming that you did with the principals.
Right, I was able here to spend most of a full day with the two administrators here. And we really went through room by room and office by office to make sure that we had space for all the support personnel in the building. Well, I work on a lot of buildings that are about this age because the vast majority of high schools in the state were built between 1960 and 1975. This is one of the earlier ones. Montpelier's a little older. Colchester is probably one of the very last ones in 1975. But they all suffer from having been built for the educational systems that were in place at that time, which were a bunch of these ice cube tray classrooms. And you had classrooms and a teacher in the room, and that was more or less it. I mean, you can see by just how much space is available in this building for guidance and the front office. It's an amazingly small amount of space. And so therefore, you end up with a lot of personnel kind of crammed in all kinds of different places around the building. I mean, the intensive special needs program is over in the very front of the middle level of F building and kind of tucked away there by the tech center. So we spent a lot of time going through each of those things: guidance, health, intensive special needs, special education, the student support center, and whatnot, so that we don't have kids dropping off hockey bags in the front office and having them sitting there all day for every visitor that comes in to see them. So that was not to mention, and that's just kind of logistics there. There's also the need for a lot of conference rooms or breakout spaces. Teaching has changed a lot over in the last 20, well, actually in the last 10 or 15 years, really, I've seen a huge change in this, in that the breakout groups where teachers will break students down into smaller groups and so that you can really start to tailor educational instruction to individual or small groups of students who so that you really are teaching to the individual students a lot more. And when you've got a bunch of rooms that are 700 square feet and that's all you got, well, it doesn't work that well. So we are trying in this plan, and I think we achieve that with these areas where there are places for students and adults to interact in a comfortable way, and not in the middle of where visitors are coming in and out of the building. So, and we've tried to put some of these smaller breakout rooms and tutoring spaces and whatnot throughout the building in kind of key spots, as well as putting the faculty spaces in places that are very accessible to students, so that there's a lot of not only collaboration between faculty members themselves in these spaces, but also between faculty members and students.
Thank you. I'm going to just, for a point of order, I'm going to take questions from commissioners, and then at 7:30 we will start the public comment. I know Fran Brock is here to speak. She's our only, right now, public comment, and then the commissioners are arriving, so we want to make sure that we start on time for them. So we'll start with Commissioner Pillsbury.
I have two questions. Since we're talking about enhancement, I was wondering why you didn't list energy efficiency as an enhancement. Is that's not what we're doing? Is not really a big enhancement to mention as accessibility?
We're definitely doing major enhancements for efficiency. Now might be a good time to turn some of this discussion over to
I'm just looking at your list, and I thought one of our reasons for doing this was to have better energy efficiency. And
It absolutely is, and you know, I don't know whether that was just us missing that in the list of common words as we talked a moment ago, but you know, energy efficiency has been something that the Black River Design has been kind of incorporating into our buildings for 35 years.
That's all I really need to know. Just bring it to your point. I know the answer. Okay, the second question is, I think I know the answer. I just wanted to be said. When you mentioned 21st century learning facilities, I think a lot of us who are going to be voting on this think of the fads that we went through, the open classroom, and the various fads that we had through the different decades, because education changes. I don't see necessarily in this thing a lot of fad kind of things that we're going to say, oh, we don't need this after 10 years. It seems like it's a functional. Am I right in that description of this? When you say 21st century learning, you're really saying we're making it so it's they're bright, inviting, and classrooms with plenty of space for various activities to go on.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just want to, what we're really trying to do is enhance collaboration. So some of that will be done with
that
divider
takes
walls.
space.
A lot of that will also be done with different furniture and whatnot. And a lot of that is also done by the very thoughtful process of which programs belong next to other programs.
Right. Well, I just wanted to make sure that we're clear about that when we talk about it.
Yeah.
Commissioner Fisher?
Thank you, Chair. Can you talk a little about long-range enrollment projections and the space utilization?
John, you can speak to that, right?
I can, but I can speak
I don't know
to
if
most anything.
I'm the right person to speak about long-range enrollment projections, but basically, what I do know is Burlington is consistent to level fund our enrollment projections for a number of years. The driver in our, what would be a possible increase in enrollment is around our number of refugee families that we used to receive that are currently on hold. So Burlington, unlike the rest of the state, is not declining enrollments, but we're also not increasing in enrollments. We're kind of staying at a level.
So one of the ways I've kind of described it the last couple of years, looking at the data and the projection, the state of Vermont, the population is declining in most districts. But fortunately for us, we do sort of a peaks and valley. We do a little bit of spike, and then we drop down a little bit, a little spike. So if you look at the graph overall, we're pretty much plateau. So we don't anticipate a significant spike in growth that we could manage in the school, but we will have some growth, modest growth, and then we'll have some downtimes. If you look at our trends from elementary, there was a spike, there's a bubble in middle school. You can see it coming, right? So they're gonna come, but there's also attrition once they get to high school as well too. So we'll capture some of those kids, but it's not significant that we can't manage. And it's not something that we need to be like, oh, we need to add 500 more spaces or anything like that.
Commissioner Wood? Okay, two quick, the first one's super quick. The building is built for the capacity of how many students? 1,000?
Yeah, roughly 1,000, that's correct. We're not increasing the number of classrooms that we currently have, and we have, worked with Noel looking at class sizes that range from 16 students to 25 students, so that we're building those classrooms so that they can meet the, full capacity of students. So there is some flexibility as those class sizes increase. Yep.
More important to me is my second question. Given the scientific community's belief and maybe our personal anecdotal experience in greater weather extremes, global warming, and the long-lived nature of this building, and frankly, I think the desire to better utilize year-round a building like this, whether it's having classes in the summertime or other programming, similar to Champlain College, utilizing their facilities year-round. It strikes me as a real oversight not to figure out how to put air conditioning in the classrooms, how to really put climate control in there. So I guess I ask, is there any conceivable way we can do that in a way that we can afford it?
Or at what expense?
Good question, for sure. So first, if, Carson, can you go to slide 4, maybe?
Today's slide deck?
Yep, today. So if you click on the link, actually, to the detail options link. So first, our very first task was to try to meet a budget of $60 million. That was a very hard task for us to accomplish, given the scope of this project. So we were trying to identify what areas that we could reduce the scope in order to meet that $60 million option. So air conditioning is one large expense that we looked at cutting out of this project. Not only is it a large expense, it's also not utilized throughout the entire school year, so the value of that expense is less, because typically in schools you use it during the swing seasons of the first months of school and the last month of school, and definitely, as we increase the use of our summer programming, there is the additional need for that air conditioning during the summer. So it's not that we didn't incorporate this into any of our options. It just, unfortunately, it fell into our most expensive option that didn't even make it to the 3 different scenarios that the board had asked us to do bond debt amounts on. So it actually currently lies in the $74 million scenario. One of the things that we are proposing in the 68.5 is to do dehumidification to the classroom. I do want our mechanical engineer to explain a little bit about what that detail includes. But then I also want to add that we do know the cost of what it would cost to air condition the rest of the building, which would be an additional $1.5 million. So it's still on the table to air condition the entire building, but that would cost an additional $1.5 million on top of the proposed 68.5 that option that we put out there without doing the
Can I just
additional.
comment too, just to clarify, Marty, if let's say the board decided they wanted to go that route in terms of 1.5 million, that's something that we could also even plan for implementing, because you haven't got to the design stage yet, and, right, we have some time to do that, as well as looking at the actual full implementation in terms of getting strategy around those funds if it wasn't even bond money, right?
Right. So, George, if you wouldn't mind speaking, just a broad overview of the system that we're proposing to install, such as the heat pump, et cetera, and.
Yeah, I'm gonna just kind of go down, just try to understand give a description of kind of each option. So I just want to like break it down to three components, I guess. Building envelope, temperature control within the spaces, and indoor air quality. Obviously, the program was developed based on a certain square footage, and that, that can be manipulated, but based on the square footage, there's a certain cost for each option based on that programming. So the building envelope, you have a good architect, he's gonna design a great envelope that basically keeps everything outdoors from coming inside. You wanna minimize anything, infiltration from the outdoors going in, and have a good envelope so you keep all the heat from coming into the building. So that's kind of a standard. We tune that up through a few different methods, but we want to have a solid envelope that's going to be what keeps your building going for 50+ years. Temperature control. So this is where there's always compromises in buildings. Currently, there's mostly just heating in this building, so you can maintain temperature during the winter months, but in the summer months, obviously, you get high humidity and high temperatures in the spaces. So those in each option, obviously there's varying degrees. If you can live with just heating, then that takes out a lot of money from the budget. If you need cooling, if it seems like that's where the direction's going, then we should look at cooling, and that's a hard decision you're gonna have to make. Indoor air quality is basically bringing outdoor air in to maintain, fresh air circulation in the spaces. So, your CO2 levels, keep them down, which promote, less drowsiness in the students, better learning, etc. So that's kind of the other component, and that is kind of counterintuitive to everything else because you're actually taking the air, you build this envelope, and you're taking all that air and putting it inside. So we manipulate that with energy recovery, which is, preheating the exhaust air with the outdoor air to, have some energy savings there. And also, the dehumidification component is basically we actually air condition just that ventilation air. So you're not air conditioning the space, but you're air conditioning the outdoor air that we're bringing into the space. So you're not bringing in, if it's 80 degrees out and 90% relative humidity, you're not just bringing that directly into space, which is going to cause comfort concerns in the space. So that's kind of where we say dehumidification. We're kind of conditioning that component that we're actually, taking the outdoor air and bringing into space. We're alleviating that load to the space. So you're not actually conditioning the air. You're not going to get 65 degree space temperature, but you're helping out in those hotter months. So I guess my point is, if you had an unlimited budget, we could do cooling, we could do everything, but there's always compromise, and those compromises are based on the interior finishes, temperature control in the spaces, etc.
Thank you, Joe.
Commissioner Curry. So it's my understanding that BED is looking for sites to deploy large solar that would allow us, if we did it, the rooftop solar would allow us to put cold climate heat pumps in certain rooms that would be programmed for summer use. And so again, I understand that you would not normally talk with the city this early, but because of the nature of this project, it seems to me that it would benefit both us and the city council to understand what BED's interest is that would allow us to not only cool the building, but eliminate our electric costs as a huge savings. And overall, I just think that this is a complex enough project that we want to seriously consider using an ESCO to do all of this analysis and technical assistance and financing recommendations. And I'm just wondering, why we're not using an ESCO and what the thinking is on that.
We have initiated the conversations with BED. They've, at least reviewed the same materials that have been given to you. And we have a meeting scheduled, I think, in 2 weeks from now, and we'll look at the ESCO as an option as well.
Do you know of an ESCO to talk to? Do you know who to use in Vermont?
Yes, Commons Energy, yeah.
No, I've been speaking with, I spoke with Mike Davey from EEI, who just did the project in Virgins, and he is looking at doing a project in Richmond.
Yeah.
So, that's one option, and obviously Johnson Controls is a much bigger concern.
Yeah.
But, we'll have to when we get right down to it, we have to kind of match the right consultant with this project.
Yeah, I mean, I would think we'd want to do an RFP at some point soon, but the point is, like, if there isn't an energy consultant on the project soon, who can, really advise on all of these issues, then we miss the opportunity to dig into them for the appropriate, design and finance analysis.
And I just want to add that I have had conversation with Norm Edkin about possibly being a consultant to help us through that, putting together that RFP for us.
And what's your timeline on that?
We don't have a specific timeline.
Need a bond first.
Yeah, we need a bond first and pick an option in order to move ahead with those additional costs of those additional
Yeah, I don't know if we do
consultants.
need a bond first. I think that Norm would actually inform the conversation to be able to answer many of these questions, which become unwieldy without being, have a framework for addressing the energy efficiency.
I mean, there's a couple layers here of information. I'm gonna let George actually,
Yeah.
he's chomping to say
Sorry,
something.
yeah, we basically, this is kind of standard, we work with BED all the time on this. We actually use an energy model to select envelopes. So when I was kind of talking about tuning the envelope and all the mechanical systems, we actually, typically it's like 12 different options based on glazing, envelope construction, infiltration, VRF systems, water source heat pump systems. We put a cost to each one of those systems. And we actually have an energy model which takes, 1 hour out of every year, so 760 points, and it gives you the energy usage per year. So you can actually say, oh, with this, the energy usage is going to be this much, but there's an operating cost of this. So, so you pick and choose, you look at paybacks, and that's how we select.
Right.
So and then we work with BED, and what they'll do is they'll say, well, we don't really have enough money to put this envelope in, but look how much it saves us. They'll say, okay, well, we want to give you incentive money to get to that option because it's well worth it, and because the payback's so great. So that's how the next step we kind of work with. But first we got to get the programming done and get the the square footage, and then that's the next step where we actually choose. Is there going to be cooling? Is that a decision that's made, or is it not? And then we kind of move to. That's how we kind of input everything into the energy model. So that is happening. It's just it's the next phase, I would say.
Right. What do you mean phase? Like?
Well, it's.
Can I just answer a piece of this?
Yeah.
So we are working off an existing proposal with Black River Design that this board put out in 2013. So the level that they've provided to date is beyond what that existing proposal was for. We would have to look at, doing additional scope of work from what they're committed to provide from that process. So the level of involvement from the engineers is
Has gone above.
correct.
Sure, well, in closing, I just want Kate Stein from our envisioning committee to say the last words. She's been waiting, she's part of the team, and she's been waiting patiently, so.
And then into that, just so we're clear, after Commissioner Curry, and thank you for explaining the building envelope, temp control, climate quality, that was a huge education, to even know what the price tag would be, the 1.5 million, that's important to us. But it speaks volumes to Liz's question to all of us is, you're working off of a plan from a board 2013. This is our first meeting that we've had to discuss the scope of this project, which leads us to, these questions can be answered, or should they be answered, or is there more time needed for us to be able to arrive at those estimates and relook at the 2018 budget and costs? So thank you. I appreciate you asking the questions and explaining based on that. Kate.
Hi, thanks. I was specifically asked to just briefly talk about the amount of community engagement we've done so far. I looked back at my notes, and over a year ago, I went to one of the bagels with the mayor, or the coffee, whatever they're called, and engaged him and said, I want you to know, remember the tour we took a bunch of years ago? We're delving into this at this point. And then we started by going to MPA meetings at the Re-envisioning Committee and speaking with them. I kept the school board up to date as I could. I went to the Burlington High School lead teacher meeting, so we've engaged them. We had 3 community input sessions. I went to BHS Parent Coffee. We did more community input. BHS staff, I asked them to gather, and a few of them met with me. I went to Hunt PTO. I engaged the 11th grade, who are now our senior class, in the community engagement, asking their opinions and letting them know what our ideas were, because we were hoping, they would be behind us when they very much were. And I held input meetings for students specifically during the choice time in the morning to make sure that we had input from them. And we did more MPAs. We've held 3 tours of the high school, and under Marty's tutelage here, we had CX Associates do an owner project requirement with, and you'll have to tell me specifically, there was one with community, there was one with administration, and one with
Correct.
teachers.
Correct.
So that's pretty much what we've done so far. We know that there can be more done, but it's a group of volunteers who've been putting this together to that date. So I want to thank the board for everything you're about to do for us and the kids in the future. Thanks.
Thank you, Kate. And next we'll move to, we will close that portion of the agenda for discussion, and we will move to public comment, which will include Fran Brock, BHS teacher, and then the city councilors. Welcome.
Good evening. I'm Frank Brock, history teacher here at BHS and a resident from Ward 5. I'm here to raise a few concerns regarding the proposed revisions to BHS. First, please understand that I am totally in favor of rebuilding BHS. I've heard and been a participant in conversations about a new high school for more than 20 years. I'm impressed and excited that the matter is finally front and center. And over those 20-plus years, BHS teachers and staff repeatedly have been asked for their ideas and opinions. I understand many of those surveys that were put on a shelf have been consulted as the revisioning project developed. However, I'm uneasy with the proposed bond you want to put before the voters in November. There are details that have either not been clearly explained or are missing. Admittedly, details I'm most concerned with have to do with academic student space, such as classrooms, study rooms, and science labs. I'm concerned that the plans seem to indicate larger science labs, which could jeopardize teaching, create potential hazards, and could contradict national science guidelines. I appreciate the idea is to create flexible classroom space, but I cannot see on the posted plans designated seminar rooms, amphitheater-style rooms, or small study rooms where teams of students can work. I also would like a firm confirmation that all academic spaces will be fully wired and furnished with state-of-the-art equipment that best enables flexible teaching options, as well as an abundance of outlets for students to recharge and use their electronic equipment. And I'm concerned that the proposal seems to have air conditioning in administrative offices, cafeteria, and I think the library, but not the classrooms. All student workspace must have air conditioning that creates air quality and room temperatures that best serve student learning. Since teachers are only coming back into school this week, we have not had the opportunity to review these plans carefully. A group of BHS teachers will be meeting after school this week to craft a recommendation on the proposals for the BEA's Executive Council as it considers its position on the plans. But the council is scheduled to have its first meeting of the school year on September 6th. I'm concerned that teacher input will be moot if the board votes on a bond issue tonight. Teacher support could be useful for getting a bond passed. High school teachers are very much behind rebuilding BHS. We are most acutely aware of the problems of the campus. For years, we've been making things work in the face of overwhelming obstacles. But as both a teacher and a taxpayer, I want to make sure that we are building a new high school that will be well-constructed and really serve our needs now and be flexible enough to serve needs for perhaps the next 100 years. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fran. So, next, welcome city councilors.
Do you want to ask if there's any other public comment?
We're gonna move there, this is public comment, city councilors. So, the city councilors, welcome. If you want, I think the best, yep, we have the two mics. Do you want to come closer and we sit more intimately so that you can speak freely?
Join us right up here.
What's that?
Do they want to join us?
Good evening, and first, Jeff, sometime after this, I'd love to hear your take on this versus the tree issue that you were talking about. Love to hear your perspective. So, anyway, let me start out by saying good evening, Madam Chair and members of the school board. And let me thank everyone for your service on the school board. I know it is a sometimes thankless job, so let me thank you all for serving. Next, let me also thank you for the tours that the school has had for all of us. Those were, I think, very helpful. I've been in the school before, but I think those were also very useful. Now, if the question is, should the high school be renovated? Is the high school in need of a massive overhaul and renovation? The answer, in my opinion, and I think most people, is a resounding yes. There is no question that this school is in need of a major overhaul, a major renovation. The question is timing, the question is the plan, and the question is, and I thought it was interesting, some of the concerns that Fran just raised as a teacher and as the president of the union. This plan is obviously a very significant plan. It is extremely important that it's done right. We just heard about the public engagement, and I appreciate that, and I know there has been significant work done, but it was a plan that was out there for a while and kind of disappeared from the public radar, then came back. But I can tell you, for example, we see here tonight for as big of a plan as this is, there's only a handful of people here. And I think that's partly because people are still in summer mode right now, and they're not focusing on this. And so we're putting this in front of them at a time and asking for a November ballot question, and I think this is a very ambitious and short timeline. A couple of city councilors, myself, Councilor Nodell, Councilor Mason, and the mayor actually met with the superintendent and the chair and a couple of other members and relayed some of our concerns about the timeline a few weeks ago. I'm not going to, I know you've all received the mayor's letter, and that really encapsulates many of my questions. And I know you've talked about some of them tonight. One of the other things I heard at the tour from some residents who, again, are very thoughtful people and very big supporters of, in fact, would have said that this should have been done 15, 20 years ago. Should have been done a long time ago. But they also felt like, let's get this right now. Now that we've come this far, let's not just rush this onto the ballot. Let's make sure it's the right plan and take the time to get it in front of the voters in a way where we have a unified front. The comment that was made to me a number of times by people was that they thought it would be helpful to have seen a 3D model, and there hasn't been one yet. I know there has been a model on the screen, but a 3D model is something that people have mentioned to me. It's something that we insisted with the Burlington Town Center issue, and that was a project that's going to be an investment that's going to be poured into Burlington. This is an investment, but taxpayers will be footing the bill here for something that's extremely important. But I think that as we sit here on August 21st, we still have not seen that. I still think there are some unanswered questions, and let me just tell you where I start with on this, and this is just me. I'm speaking only for myself. But I am always of the mind that I start with big ticket money items ought to be on the ballot in March. That's when we focus, we have the most dialogue about it. It's when we focus on these issues. It's when counselors take positions on them, the mayor. And rushing something on the ballot in November when we have so much else, so many other things going on, the governor's race, lieutenant governor, legislative races, and everything else. While it's been out there in meetings with small groups, at MPAs, I can tell you that we've had other issues before that have been thought to have been vetted in small groups, but then when they're not really focused on by the public until they are actually fully out there with a plan that everybody knows now is going to happen, is going to go in front of the voters. And so people haven't, many voters that I've talked to have not known that this is going to be coming forward now. And we are, we're less than 2.5 months from Election Day in November. So again, I think the mayor's letter encapsulates many of my questions. I think that the debt capacity issue also continues to lurk out there. We don't know the answer to that yet. I think that we will know more about that soon. But again, as we sit here 2.5 months from the election, we don't know the answer to the debt capacity issue. I appreciate the time that you put aside for city councilors to speak tonight. I should, just to make sure you know, though, that when you come with the presentation next Monday, there certainly still may be additional questions that councilors will form either between now and then or may actually come up with that night. So let me leave it there and let other councilors come up and let you know what they think. But I am not, I'm keeping an open mind to this. I haven't made any final decision on it. I will wait and hear more. I'll hear the presentation at the City Council Monday night and go from there. But I do start with some very big reservations. But let there be no question that I absolutely am in favor of and recognize the need for a major renovation of the high school. It has to happen, whether it's in November, whether it's in March. We do need to have a very substantial renovation.
Thank you, Councilor Wright.
Thank you.
Good evening. Thanks for this time, and thanks for all your work. Completely agree with the fact that we need to do this. This project has to be done, and I think there is going to be broad support in the public for the project when it comes forward. But we have to make sure that some really big questions are answered in a very clear and definitive way when we bring it. So I just want to use my time to highlight some of the areas where, when you come on Monday to the City Council, some more detail or answers could be provided to kind of build the case. And a couple of these were addressed in the mayor's memo to the board and to the superintendent. So on the tax impact, I think we really need the detail on how these numbers, in terms of the impact on the property tax bill for homeowners, including those who are income sensitized, were calculated. And was it assumed that all of the debt service would be covered from Burlington taxpayers? Or have we assumed that there would be some of the debt service that would be paid by the statewide property tax? And that gets to the interface between funding this project and the state education finance system. So when the city issues a bond, we are assuming that a general obligation bond is totally serviced from the Burlington property tax base. So have you made that same assumption in this case or not? You have some estimates of what's a household that qualifies for income sensitivity, what they would pay. But we didn't see any slide of what would a household who's not income sensitized, what do they pay? Are they picking up the difference, et cetera? So I think it would be good to lay that out. On debt capacity, there are some questions that we need to get from Moody's about how this debt, this borrowing would be treated, and we don't have those answers yet. And I think that we have to get those answers before we can go out, and responsibly go out with a $60 to $70 million bond issue. And those have to do with how they'll treat the city and the schools, whether individually or separate, and whether all the property tax revenue that comes in to the city and the schools will be treated as available to service debt. And importantly, how the tax increment financing debt that the city has issued would be treated in any calculation of a debt ceiling. So the answers to those questions matter a lot to our understanding of how much debt we can responsibly issue as a community. And it would be just hard for me personally to vote to put something, even a great project like this, on the ballot before I have clear answers to those questions. And the timeline is in part out of our control because we need other people to give us information, which hopefully will come in a timely way, but we can't ensure that it will. I wanted to follow up on a line of questioning I think that Commissioner Curry was starting, and it has to do with the $39 million that of existing borrowing authorization for facilities that the school department has, between the $2 million annually and the $19 million authorized borrowing for facilities. So I'm assuming that within those work plans, there were projects that were going to be happening at the high school to address deferred maintenance at the high school. And I would guess that that work is going to now be done through the $60 million or $70 million bond issue, in which case you don't need all of that debt capacity that we're now talking about. Say if there's $10 million of work that was going to be done through those other borrowing streams, then you don't need to borrow it again through the bond to get the work done. And it would be, if that's true, it might not be true, that would be a way to get the number down, and getting the number down and still do all the work we need to do is obviously something that we should do. Okay. So finally, following up on the question from Ms. Brock about the instructional IT equipment and furniture and so forth, is that all in the $60 to $70 million? It is. Okay, great. It is. Great. Thank you very much. Look forward to continuing the dialogue next Monday.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Hi, welcome.
Thank you, Chair Wool. Thank you for having this, affording us this opportunity in advance of Monday's meeting to sort of put questions. I'll be brief because I think, unbeknownst to me, the mayor, I didn't know the mayor's letter was coming until I came here tonight. So I do think that does set forth a number of the concerns that have been raised, I think, by those of us who have been sort of in front of this. The other question that I didn't see asked, though, in light of all of those concerns and the ones raised tonight, is why does this have to be in November? You know, if you could come Monday prepared to answer that question. I will echo the sentiment, you know, as someone who walked out of this building in 1987 as a graduate and sort of walks in and it's the same building. I am well aware of the need for this. I'm just somewhat questioning, in light of all of these concerns, why does this have to be on such a rush basis? So I'll leave with that, and then sort of look forward to the additional responses. I'm assuming there'll be some sort of formal response to the mayor's questions. I would ask, you know, if and when that's made, that's shared with the entire council to sort of afford us an opportunity to digest all of that. And obviously, I know there were a lot of questions, so I don't know timing in terms of when the response will, but certainly the sooner those responses are provided, the better to enable us to digest them. Thank you.
Thank you.
It is.
Welcome, Commissioner.
Thank you. I thought it'd be a good contrast from our attorney dressed for court, me dressed for working for a nonprofit. So I think the the points that have been raised are all valid ones and very important ones to consider. And I actually am probably on a different page than the counselors who've spoken. I think that November is actually the critical time for this vote to happen, and I hope you all will come to that conclusion, and I hope the council will as well. I moved to Burlington in 1981. Just before I arrived, there was a special election in the summer of 1981. We had a new mayor. Burlington was really excited about where it was going with sort of people-oriented politics, and they held a special election to decide if we were going to have rent control in Burlington. The forces were incredibly organized on both sides, and it was defeated 2-1 after just electing a Democratic Socialist mayor. Burlington 2-1 said no to rent control. Seems kind of strange, right? November elections are the time when the most people engage and turn out in our elections. I understand what Councilor Wright's saying about March being the time when we might discuss money issues, but really there's no denying that November is the time when people show up. You can't do this in a special election. You have to do it when we're holding an election anyway. If we don't do it in November of this year, it would come up in March of 19. In March of 19, if it's not successful, because it will be competing with other questions that have to do with money, it then gets postponed until March of 2020. So I'm going to be a pragmatist here and say I think it's better to bring it to the voters, not allow the need for every single question to be answered in August for a question you're going to be deciding in the second week of November to be what guides you. I think really, if this board can get behind it and the school board and the city council can get behind it, we're going to have the support that I think this community will need, be visible support that the community needs. I was active in a couple of bond questions for our schools. One was the renovation of H.O. Wheeler and the other was Lawrence Barnes in the 1980s. And we were told, no way, this was not going to be viable. We couldn't get these little teeny schools that were struggling to get voter support throughout the city, and they got 2/3 approval for those bond questions at a time when we were not particularly, our economy was not doing great. So I think we have to remember that when Burlington voters are asked to support the children of this community, they come forward in very large numbers. I think 2 months is actually plenty of time, and honestly, I think September, October, and the first week of November gives us more time than probably we will spend in March, because really we get through the holidays and no one's going to focus on this between Thanksgiving and Christmas. Then you get to the new year and you've got, basically most of January and February, and then we vote very shortly thereafter. So I don't think there's a real competition there in terms of voter engagement. So I would just say, again, try to remember the notion that the perfect is sometimes the enemy of the good. And I know we're not going to get perfection here. We're probably going to come forward with something that won't be perfect, but we need to move forward, and we can't wait till March of 2020, which is, I'm afraid, what will happen if we postpone this vote till March. Thanks.
Thank you. Hi, welcome, Councilor Dean.
Thank you, Chair Wolf. So I'll come at this from a slightly different perspective. I recognize many of the consultants who are sitting here at this end of the table, and I've worked on that side. They're a great group and people I certainly respect. I think I was able to attend the presentation last week, which kind of laid out for the first time for me the strategy for solving some of the critical issues that face this facility, which I walked out of as a senior in 1977, so a while before Chip Mason, Councilor Mason. So there was one particular piece. First of all, I'd like to say that I think that the strategy that the architects and the engineering team have arrived at is a really successful strategy. I was encouraged to see that many of the issues have been addressed with, I think, an economy of means. And I think reusing the existing facilities of the school are important for us to hope to make this work financially. There was one piece that was of concern to me, though, that I did not understand the genesis of, and that was a community gymnasium or a community gathering space that's added. I didn't understand where in the kind of programming aspects or programming process that led to this, where that came from. To me, I think that needs to be explained. I don't understand it. It's certainly something that we've seen in other schools and projects that we've worked on, but I think that we need to have for the public who are going to be looking at those plans and asking those questions, we need to be able to answer that question. I think my other concern comes from current experience working in the construction field and trying to bring projects in on budget. We are seeing significant escalations in construction costs just in the last few months. And as I look at the budget that's been, kind of laid out here in outline form, I see a contingency of about 10%. And my expectation for a project of this design development level, which is very, very schematic, is that we would be seeing at least 4% required to address escalation in construction cost. We would need an owner's contingency of about 7.5% going into a renovation, so already up to 11%. And then we also need something called a design or an estimating contingency, which means that right now the project documents are very, very schematic. It's very hard for us to understand what is needed. Not everything is drawn, and typically it requires, at this very early stage, at least a 10% and more likely a 15% design/estimating contingency to deal with all of that that's not currently shown in the document. So my concern is that we're going out to the public with assurances that this is somewhere between a $65 and $70 million project, but I want to understand and be able to convey to the public that we have a strong basis to make that claim. So I would like to know who, was there an independent cost estimator that established these numbers? What was the process that got us there? How long ago were they established? And can we have confidence that as we actually go out and ask for this money from the public, that it doesn't come back to us that no, what's really needed is $80 million, because then we're really in a very difficult situation where we don't have the authorization to bond for the money that's required to get the project done. And I would hate us to take that step forward with that not being understood and addressed before doing that. So those are very specific concerns that would be great to get some answers about. Thank you.
Thank you. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having us in. Many of the questions that I had have already been asked, so I'm not going to repeat them. I'll share. I think everyone has a bit of an emotional connection to this project, which I think is worth recognizing. I was not a graduate of BHS, but my kids will be, so that's my connection to this from looking forward. I thought we were going to do something different tonight.
Well, sorry to interrupt.
Please go ahead.
We will do some Q&A. They can respond as well. So the format sort of evolved as is.
Sure.
So everyone has a chance to sort of speak, and then we can answer those questions.
Great. So that kind of conditions what I'll say. It'll be great to hear some feedback, and if anything that you can't immediately respond to, it'd be great to have prepared for Monday to kind of preempt a lot of those questions, because I'm sure they'll be asked again, or they're on the mind of other counselors. So that's a request that happens. I'll say also, I would ask the board to consider the other side of the argument that Councilor Pine made, which was an argument for November. Looking at if this was a presidential November, I think that argument would have a lot more oomph to it. There would be a much higher turnout in November if this was presidential. The comparables are actually within 1,500 votes. If you look at 2014, the November and March elections are actually a lot closer than you think, and I think that just speaks to the folks that vote in Burlington and vote often are that cohort, and then you see a jump in those presidential years. That being said, with an election around 10,000 that's going to happen, a narrative that this plan isn't fully vetted is something that the item might need to contend with. If the narrative is already spinning up now, it's most likely going to carry forward. So while there are benefits to a November versus March, I think there are benefits in the alternative as well, as there are with most election cycles. So I'll leave you just with that to consider, and I'll add one last question. What is the action that this body is planning on making this evening, if any?
Thank you.
Well, the staff has brought forward information and a recommendation with 3 options, and we're hoping that the board will deliberate and decide on a recommendation that we would bring to City Council to share with you to determine if we would be willing to put that onto the ballot.
So I think at this time, we can answer, John, and your staff that's here. I know that you'll be with us, but potentially not everybody on the following Monday. So would you like to answer? We can start with some of the questions that Councilor Dean had pertaining to, and I can refresh you.
Let me just preface that our visitors here have limited time. They weren't expected to stay this long, so as long as we have them, I know many of them are going to be heading out in a minute. But we certainly will be able to capture many of the questions. Thank you for the questions from Monday as well. And we do hopefully have an opportunity tonight to answer a few questions that we think we can respond to right away.
So I did take a couple notes. I think there's a couple questions I can start to address. I think the idea that the additional gym was initially an educational requirement for additional PE space, an additional instructional space to teach gym classes. At the same time, the school has been focused, I think, from the beginning of the programming discussions of making this a community space. And whereas the existing gym is up on essentially the third floor and not as accessible, that since we have the opportunity to do another smaller gym, this will allow us to have an athletic facility that is closer to the ball fields as well, that is more accessible to the public and easier to isolate from the rest of the building for evening use. So it's primarily an educational need, but I think it has a significant community component to it. And beyond that, I'm gonna let the educators and the school folks kind of talk more about that. In terms of the estimate, you're absolutely right. There's 1,000 different ways to kind of put some of those contingencies into this estimate. Trying to get it so that it's as easy to understand without confusing people. I know you know the challenges of that. There is a full 10% contingency that has always been recommended by the Education Department for what I call bidding and a design, not a design, but a construction contingency. In addition, I do have a full 4% inflation factor built into that, in my more detailed piece. And then I'd say lastly, for the design contingency is even more difficult to try to put in there, but I've tried very hard as I went through each of the individual components of the project into my spreadsheet that I've been using as I've been working back and forth with my estimator, is to try to just incorporate that into there. So when I talk about flooring, for example, I try to put an allowance or a projection in there that includes some of that design contingency. If I put that all the way through, that's where I start to get criticism ultimately about, well, how can the building ever cost that much? And then I also get the questions of, well, how can it only cost that much? So we try to, try to go somewhere in the middle that we think we can deliver products for that amount. Anyway, that's what I've got. I have been thinking about that, and again, we spent a lot of time trying to think about what I call the soft costs as well, kind of design fees, contingencies, clerk of the works, moving costs, all of those different things that are in there. I mean, we have to talk about hazardous materials removal in here too, and the consulting fees for that. We're going to have an awful lot of soil investigations that Bob's going to insist that we do before he starts to design a foundation. So I do think that I've got all that in there. Reasonable estimators can always disagree, and if you want, we always get a second estimate and we'll have a different opinion. But I do think that I have tried, at least at this point, to cover my bases on that.
So just a quick comment about that extra gym. As John said, it's needed for the constraints we have around our existing PE as well as our existing school athletic programs. There's not enough gym space for all of the teams that we have that require athletic facilities. Really the value add is to also have that facility available for other events that might take place in the community, but that's not the driver of the need of that space. And it's also going to be designed to be fully functional, more as a multi-purpose room than just specifically for a gym. So, for example, maybe a space to have board meetings or other types of functions that allow it to be flexible in its use. I'm gonna just quickly comment about the capital plan and the additional funds that were set aside, that are not set aside for BHS. So we knew when we came out to the, when we put out our capital bond to the community, we separated all of BHS capital needs from that. We identified $30 million worth of need for this particular building. So we separated that $30 million from our capital plan. What we then decided was to build in, I believe it was roughly $1 million as a contingency if something was to happen in this building that required us to do upgrades until this bond actually passed. For example, we're upgrading the elevator this particular summer out of those particular funds, but there's definitely not $10 million set aside out of that plan.
Thank you, Martin. And I think, I'm not sure if council received the other set of package we had that had some more detailed budget items. Would probably give you an opportunity to look at some of the different cost questions that you have, but we'll be certainly be sure to send that package out again. I'm going to ask our Director of Finance to come and review a number of questions that are around the finance piece. And earlier in our presentation to the board, we did go over a number of areas. I know some counselors came in probably after that, but I think it's a good opportunity to kind of revisit that as well. And we'll certainly repeat that on Monday as well.
Thanks. Carson, would you mind going back to the presentation from tonight? I just wanted to specifically call Councilor Nodell's attention to a couple of the slides that are in this presentation that were also in the presentation last week that might help address the question about what the impact will be on both property and income payers. There we go. One more, please. Bingo. Okay. So here we did a chart that shows the kind of ramping up, the plateauing, and then the retirement of debt associated with the various plans, and we show the marginal impact here on a individual taxpayer who pays based on the value of their property and pays on a $250,000 home. The $250,000 home was picked because based on first of all, because it's kind of a nice round number, but it wasn't picked out of thin air. It is actually pretty close to the median home taxable value according to the U.S. Census. Sometimes people say, well, gee, my home is way more or way less than that. It's important to keep in mind two things. Obviously, individual results will vary. The good news is that this is a linear function. So if your house is worth twice that much, you can just double all of these amounts to get a sense of what the impact would be. It's also important to understand the difference between the value at which your property is assessed for tax purposes versus what you think it might or might not sell for on the open market. Remember, the tax rates are based on those assessed values, and we know based on the common level of appraisal in Burlington that our assessed values are typically substantially below the market value of those homes. So it's important to kind of have that, bear that in mind when you're looking at these numbers. But we do have information about estimated impact on taxpayers, and then the very next slide, which again we didn't linger on tonight, but it's part of the documents that are posted tonight, and we covered it at the last meeting, shows the hypothetical impact on a taxpayer who pays based on income and what their income cap would be. We've translated it into dollar terms here with respect to each of the different scenarios. So we have done that analysis as well, and that's available online. We certainly would plan to bring that to you on Monday. There was another question about how the state financing system works, and that is probably a conversation best left for Monday. It's something I'm happy to talk about, and so I'll be prepared to do that. One thing I just will flag, it was clear to me that there's perhaps not a full understanding of how that system works, and so when we have the opportunity on Monday to go into detail, I think what it might make clear is that in the case of the school district, by law, all of this money that we're talking about that would be raised through taxes is technically state education fund revenue, which then comes to the Burlington School District. So we can talk about that more on Monday when we visit.
I know there are a number of other questions that we'll bring on Monday, but I did want Russ to just share, because I know council hasn't had an opportunity to see this, that we did do a survey over the last few days. If you could just share just the 2 slides so council has this information. We'll bring it back on Monday in more detail, but just to give your sort of awareness in terms of our outreach.
So there was a question about, are people aware of the plan and what's going on? So we did do a survey on Friday afternoon, and we closed it this at 12:45. We had 401 respondents to the survey, which was sent out all across the city. And what you're seeing right now are just some preliminary numbers, which is showing that of the 401 respondents, over 70% would support a bond of $68.5 million. And I will also say that I sent this package to you when you arrived today so that you can actually go through not only these numbers, you can see where people live, which wards, that was a question. There was a question about, do they have kids in the system, or are they residents of Burlington without kids? So there is some support around this bond issue. And so, Carson, I would say slide 8. And then the other piece is that there was another option that says, yes, I support a bond, but I'd like to see a different amount. And so what I did was analyze some of those answers, and it's, basically there were 9 people who said they would support more. $100 million was one number that someone threw out, or anything that will give us the best of the best of the best, or how come there's not the best AC in every. There were 4 more answers that said they would support less. And there were also some people that said they would support any amount. So these are some of the numbers that I think are more accurate, which shows that 79.5% of the people who took the survey would support a bond of 60, 65, 68 or more. And 72.5% of the people who took the survey would support a bond of 68.5 or more. So you can see all of that and all of the feedback from those participants as well.
Thank you, Russ. And I'm going to turn it over to Chair Wool. One of the things, just in closing, we are here to seek the board's sort of approval around the options, but what that allows us to do is go to the next step. Many of the questions that we've had from councilors and also from community members are really around the next phase in terms of giving input into the designs and the site plans. And I know our educators want that opportunity as well. The engineers and architects that we've been working with have been contracted since 2013, and we need to develop a new agreement in terms of what the scope is, but we can't engage in that unless we know we're actually going to do a project. We couldn't spend the money on that. So that's partly where we're going in terms of the next phase. So I turned it over to the board. We received quite a bit of information. I know it's a lot, quite a bit to deliberate over, but looking forward to hearing the conversation.
At this time, I will ask each board member to share, starting with Commissioner Curry, to share where they are at after listening to tonight's input and Q&A. Share their sentiment. Yep.
Sure. I think for me, I would just say that I really believe this is our time. There's this repeated question about why is this so urgent, or what have we been up to? Why now? And I'd just like to share some perspective that there's multiple reasons why this is emerging now as the district project that needs to move forward. In 2014, we were asked by the city to undertake capital needs assessment in order to stay coordinated with theirs, and they generously supported the capital planning process. But it wasn't finalized until 2016, which is when we began planning for many years of deferred maintenance and moved forward with quantifying that in order to bring the $19 million bond request forward. During those 2 years, we stabilized the district financially. We had an interim superintendent, and then we acclimatized our new superintendent, Obang, to the district dynamics. At the same time, we were knocked back by Act 46, which prevented us from increasing property taxes, and it made our financial hill that much steeper while against the backdrop of being asked to do one-year teacher negotiations because healthcare was being restructured at the state level. So after that was done, we had to then enter again into 2-year negotiations. So we've spent 2 years negotiating 7 union contracts, revamping our governance structure so that we would have a long-term strategic plan and priorities that would guide our budgeting and rolling the capital planning into that process. So we have been, since I'd say 2013, for the past 5 years, stabilizing a $70 million operation, planning for our capital needs, asking the voters to help us recover from all of the deferred maintenance that has left our assets at risk of actually costing us more in terms of operating costs and emergency repairs. So I don't feel like this is rushed at all. I feel like this has been on the table as a conversation for as long as my kids have been in school, which is 2005, and that this really is our time. And so I think a lot of the questions that people have asked about, particularly the BEA's questions and a lot of these cost questions, they have answers at the drop of a hat in terms of where we should be when we go forward with a bond. There's no, having a 25-year background in real estate development, there's no way to answer these kinds of details before permits are submitted, but there are opportunities to have conversations with the community, with the city, with the union, and come to these agreements. And so I would like to support going forward with conditions that many of these things are incorporated into our thinking and addressed seriously with best efforts and good faith, so that we have that language guiding our guiding us going forward.
Thank you, Commissioner Curry. Commissioner Wick?
Thanks, Chair Will. This is a historic, I think, decision we'll be making as a city, as a school board. I'm absolutely for it and incredibly excited about it, having the opportunity to do this. I'm not yet comfortable figuring out what the number is tonight, because I want to do it right. I won't repeat some things that Fran Brock said and other city councilors. I want to get this right. A few things that are very important to me is I want to do this project, and I want to do it right. I want to minimize the number of times in the future that we say, gosh, didn't think of that. I want durability of materials. I want a proper layout. It sounds like we've made a ton of great progress. I want buy-in. I'd like to go with more buy-in. It sounds like the teachers are almost there, but we're sort of getting ahead of that a little bit. I'd love buy-in from the entire city council. I mean, from what we've heard from everybody, everyone's for it. It's just a matter of timing, and the delta or difference in timing is just a matter of a few months. Boy, would I love the full support of the city council in March if we can't get it in November. But mainly, I'm not comfortable. I'm definitely not comfortable based on what I've heard with 60 million. I'm not interested in the cheapest materials possible, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not even comfortable with the 65 or the 68 yet, because I do believe we need further thought on air conditioning as one example, and the contingencies. I don't want to shortchange our future, our kids in any way, and I think we need a little more time to figure out what the right number is. And if pressed tonight, my number's going to be pretty big. Just because of the speculative nature of it. I'd rather not be pressed. So I also want to be able to fulfill some of the things that City Council President Kurt Wright suggested, which is, you've done a lot of work getting out there, but you've still got a ways to go to really raise the profile of this thing. And I know the counter argument is we've still got 2 months, but all in all, I'd like to garner more support from community, input from them, determine the right dollar amount that feels really considered and prudent to me, and then go out in March. I think we stand a real high chance of success in March. The folks who vote for the school budgets come out en masse in March. I'm very confident that if we went out in March, we could get this passed with a much larger support base. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Commissioner Fisher?
Thank you, Chairwoman. You said something about being comfortable spending 60 million or 68. I am so uncomfortable spending this amount of money. That's just my upbringing. And so I want to make sure that we cross as many T's and dot as many I's as possible, knowing that we can't answer all the questions. Not everyone's voice will be heard. Not all the questions will be answered. We're asking for bond authority. We can't agree on every single design aspect. So I want to make sure that we've done everything necessary because it's such a huge commitment for our community and our taxpayers. So I have a personal stake in this. My kids are heading into BHS. So for me, I want to do it as quickly as possible. But for the city, I'm not sure that there's a rush. I'm concerned that if we go in November and we don't have support of the city council or other key stakeholders that are out there selling this, that it goes down. And that to me is a big concern, that we have to come back with a cheaper number, right? So I would support delaying this until March.
Thank you. Commissioner Pillsbury?
Very interesting comments. I was around in 2013 when we started with John, and we thought we had a pretty good plan, and then we were going to go to the mayor, and it seemed to get stopped at that point. And I've been around long enough, asking, obviously, for large tax increases as we were trying to improve our educational system for new students and upgrade our schools, do the renovations that we needed to do. And so we asked for a lot of money, and people thought we were all kinds of names. They thought we were crazy, from the Free Press editors, from the governor, and the mayor didn't really support us. And I think when we told our story, when we were out there telling our story, the people supported us. And we had one time when we had one of our largest tax increases, all 7 wards at that time voted for it. And there was one ward that we always expected would not vote for it. Now, my children are out of school. I don't have any reason to think to do this, but I know that the children in Burlington deserve a better environment to learn. That those who have difficulty moving around, we have an accessible building. All of our students need to feel, and we as parents and community members need to feel that we don't have to have a prayer and thoughts session in Burlington because we don't have the security in the schools. I know that we can do better on energy efficiency, and we can do better in bringing our students, all of our students, together, not separating them out as we have in this campus here. I think that people, it's scary. It's scary voting for a big number. This scares me. But I think it's something we have to do. And you know, once you put it out there, I believe in the people's power. That people in Burlington are mature enough to make the decision, first of all, whether it's necessary or not, and number 2, whether they can afford it. And I'm willing to put that in their hands. You know what? We don't have to win the first time, but we've brought forward something with confidence that this is something that we need to do, and I think people will consider the needs and will consider whether they really can afford it. And meanwhile, our administration knows the questions that they have to prepare to answer, and we have to be educated in order to do the preparing. I don't believe that City Council is a big brother. I don't believe that if their support's going to change people's minds, or my support for it's going to change people's minds. It's a story that we use to tell people why we need this and what the cost is, and then they're going to make up their own mind. I have faith in the city of Burlington's voters to do that. And I don't get the difference between November and March, but I think we're ready to do it now. And I think our administration, if it doesn't have the answers now, they will have the answers, and we can get that out there. And I think it's time for us to go that. We've heard a lot of talk about BT. We've heard a lot of talk about City Place, but we haven't heard a lot of talk about what our 14 to 18-year-olds need for an environment to learn in. And I think it's time that the city start to talk about the educational system that we want for our children in Burlington. Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Carey.
Well, very interesting discussion tonight. A lot of very important issues. I just want to remind people I've lived in the Old North End for 40 years, and I've taught school for 39 years. So I have, I think, an interesting perspective on the neighborhood and the schools around me and what goes on inside the schools. So I'm excited about the plans, and I absolutely support the construction of a new high school in Burlington. Particularly interesting tonight were the comments that Fran Brock made about the space usage, and I'm interested in talking more about the 21st century learning styles that are coming down the pike quickly in the forms of the YES program here at BHS and Lake Studies program. So there are all kinds of potential uses that can be built into the new building, which I'm excited about, further exploring. I want to see a high school that is emblematic of the Queen City. And I want to see a picture of it on the brochures that go out. Because Burlington, of course, everyone knows this, is a fabulous place to live. And sometimes it gets a bad rap. Sometimes that rap has a connection with the school system, and I don't understand why, because I've worked in the school system, and I see the greatness that is here already. Quite frankly, I want to see the $80 million version. I want to see the air conditioning. I want to see the outside courtyards, the teacher-student theaters, the mini theaters throughout. I want to see the green roof. But I know that may not be a possibility this time around. But nevertheless, the plans I've seen seem to be very impressive and perhaps indicative of the route we need to take right now. I agree with Brian Pine's comments about now is the time. I think the November election the November ballot is one that would promote our purposes, and I too, I'll repeat what Keith said. I am always amazed at how Burlington citizens support the school systems in ballot votes over the decades that I've looked at them. And I do believe, even if the detailed questions that some people have asked that have not already been answered in the work that the construction companies have done already, I do believe that the voters have faith in the decision that comes from the board and the city council in terms of the need and the willingness to go forward with a new building, or a renovated building. I believe that they will support that on the November ballot or the March ballot. So, and I just want to reiterate, Russ's survey was very clear that support seems to be there already. So enormous support seems to be there already. So I'm just, I think both ways. I mean, I think I could absolutely support the decision to put it on the November ballot. If push comes to shove and it has to go on the March, then that might be okay too. But right now, I'd like to see it go. The time is now. I have faith, as Keith has said, in the Burlington city voters, and perhaps we need to just do it right now. Isn't there a slogan? Just do it. We need to just do it,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Barlow.
I guess I think that we are ready, and I also am supportive of a November ballot question. I was really struck by the survey results. I didn't think it would be as conclusive as it appears to be in terms of the amount of support. And I understand it's not a scientific survey, but if it's a bellwether of the kind of support that we would get from the community, I think it's worth a try. I've been involved when I was on the Infrastructure and Technology Committee in a lot of the discussions when we resurrected the early 2013 plans. I've seen the work that John and his group have done at Lamoille with Green Mountain Tech Center. And I know that I have a lot of faith in what you brought to us, I have confidence in your ability to do it for the price you say you can. And so I have some of the concerns that I think were expressed around air conditioning. I do think as we make America even greater and hotter, we'll have maybe to need to think about, I'm sorry, that was political. But yeah, we're going to have to do something in those classrooms. So I'm not sure. If that's something we can iron out. I would like to see that done. The last thing I'll say is, just politically speaking, I thought we had a really difficult time trying to sell our school budget. It passed this last time, but if you remember, we only increased our budget by 0.8%, less than 1%. Yet we were out explaining to voters because of sort of the nature of our state financing system why their tax bill was going to go up. At the time, I think we predicted 8%. So my concern of having a $65 or $70 million ballot question on with another school budget, that even if we constrained our spending again at 1%, which I think would be difficult, but if we were able to do that again, and we still had another 8% budget increase, I think that would spell doom for the ballot question in March. I could be wrong. I was surprised by the amount of support we got 2 years ago when we went out for the $19 million bond. Even in wards that historically vote down the school budget, they voted for that bond. So I could be wrong on that, but I would hate to put those two things together on the same ballot. I think that's creating a situation that makes it more difficult for us. So I'm supportive of putting it on in November, and if it gets voted down, at least we have an opportunity to generate a lot of discussion and come back in March or next November. And I don't think it necessarily has to be a lower amount. I think we just need to do the education that's required to bring the community along. So I'm supportive of a November question.
Thank you. Commissioner Alwell.
Having missed the last meeting but watched it on the internet, I found this tonight wonderful, that I actually feel more secure with the amounts that are being put out there and that they have done all of their homework, etc. There are probably many more questions still to be had with design, and I do think it's very important that the people that are going to work in this building have input into what it looks like inside, because I know this from years of working in hospitals that were designed, and then you couldn't get a bed through a door in an x-ray room because nobody thought about that, but the people working in there would have thought about that. And not that you haven't thought about it, you've done a lot of it, and I don't mean that, but I do think that the teachers and staff here need to have input into what kind of spaces they really think they need to do this and see what you do. So I don't know whether that means it has to go on a March ballot or that is possible to do with the staff before then, or if it has to even be done before we decide on how much the bond is going to be and which time it's going to be put on the ballot. I would say that probably I'm beginning to feel, at first I thought I could, March is fine, that would be fine, but realizing that we're going to have to go out we're going to have a school tax and a bond for a high school in the same, I think that's problematic for the people voting. And I think probably it really would be better to put it on the November ballot and we all just work our tails off to get it passed. If not, then we can always look at whether it goes on March or the other. And I do have reservations about the amount. I would go for almost more because or we really figure out a fundraising contingency to get air conditioning in this building, because having run summer programs in Hunt Middle School for the last 15 years, I know how awful it is to get kids excited when we're all sweating in there because it's so hot, and it's only gonna get hotter. So I do think we should think very heavily about air conditioning for summer. But I would go with the November ballot. 70 million. And I would go with at least 68.5.
Thank you. Commissioner Gorman.
I'm ready to vote for C.
That's it? Great. Thank you. All right. Yes, Superintendent.
There's a neglected to, Carson just reminded me that we did have a NEASC review, New England Association of Schools and Colleges review, a little over a year ago. And one of the things they found was around our facilities. And we received a letter of warning, it actually says warning, around the state of the building. And I am directed to give them a progress report on actions we're taking to remedy that by October 1st. So I'm hoping the board makes some decision that I can respond back and say, yes, we've got a plan in place that we're going to respond to, because that puts our accreditation in jeopardy in terms of those other pieces. The other thing I would say for the board to consider, I know there's been a number of conversations around air conditioning. Marty did share with you that air conditioning would be another 1.5 million, so it's something for you to consider. In terms, I'll get Carson in a minute to post up the proposed question we put up, because it can be modified in however which the board wishes. If they want to add onto the C and add the 1.5, or do you want to add some language for us to direct staff to find a way to include that could also happen as well too. The other thing I want people to be clear around, not to be misunderstood around the staff input piece. There has been staff input, and Kate talked about even the organization that's done the project around that. But the next phase, once we know exactly what the amount, what the project, if it's C, then we can engage our staff and say, okay, now tell us, we're gonna build classrooms, what do we need? We're gonna build a new library, what does it look like? And that's the level of detail. Doesn't happen here, it happens once we have that direction and we can start contracting with our firm to start doing those conversations with those. And the last thing I would say, just from my equity perspective, is accessibility cannot wait. There are a number of students in our buildings that have been waiting for accessible pathways in this building, and for staff as well too. And we've got a parent here who's been championing for many years, and she's not doing it because her child's gonna benefit, because her child will be gone. But she knows there are many students coming forward that need that service, and it would be a disservice if we really didn't consider that piece in the timelines of it, of going forward. So that's my 2 cents, and I turn it over to the board for conversations. And if you want to put the first slide up and hand over to Chair Wolf.
I'm sorry. Great. Thank you, everyone, for your feedback. Go ahead.
No.
Can I make the motion?
Yeah, I think I would just like to say, as chair and as a commissioner, having spent sort of a crash course in the last month on this project, working with fellow commissioners, this is an incredibly large project by Vermont standards. And talking with the Agency of Education, talking with the architect, listening to the city councilors, we are putting a lot of faith in this number, and without a lot of education, but hiring those professionals that have the expertise that can assure us. But with that assurance, there are developments within the city, and when we receive a letter from the mayor that states his concerns, we will definitely, to answer Councilor Roof's question, the goal of this is to address the questions that were asked tonight so that we have answers on Monday, to address and to share with the entire city council those answers based on the well-thought-out and very much appreciated letter from the mayor today. He touched upon every aspect of this project that we all can relate to and that we owe answers to. And I would be remiss to say that, these questions and answers and letter, we could have discussed earlier. So I take accountability as a newly elected chair and board from April to now. My apologies for not addressing these earlier than now and coming down to this time. With that being said, tonight's request on behalf of the district and the leaders of the district who have worked, and the commissioners that were here on previous boards, the timeline exists, and it has existed based on our finance director sharing with the board and commissioners that spoke tonight, and the superintendent, based on history that has evolved between the city and the school district. So our goal tonight is to share everyone's sentiment about where they stand, whether this is a November or a March ballot item. But it's ultimately a proposal that we will make a motion to determine that and go to City Council, and it's up to you to gain your permission. But there are numerous financial questions that still have not been answered, and so we will take that time to try and answer those questions, but that the work has to get done over the next 2 months, because as we all are residents on the school board of the city of Burlington, we know how things, the process of how things get approved within the city. And it's thoughtful, and it's time, takes time. And so we are aware, I'm keenly aware, and I speak on behalf of myself, but I would imagine the board members, that we appreciate why things get done in the manner that they do and the time that it takes. But the district leaders have spoken, and this has, in their minds, been presented, and we'll decide tonight on this motion what the number is, and to go to a November bond or March. So with that being said, thank you.
So, 70 in November sounds good. Let's try. All right, I'd like to propose a motion that we adopt the language that the superintendent has proposed up there. So that's, given where everybody's at here, a November ballot item, and
Are you think?
And then I'd like to propose the number we insert is, given that I think we need to build in some contingencies, an even 70 million, and it's not to exceed 70. So up to, whatever the language is there.
Yeah,
not to exceed. Is there a second for my motion?
Commissioner Curry?
I'll give the mic back to Chair Wall here for deliberation.
Great. All right.
Any discussion?
Yep, any discussion? All right, seeing that.
Well, I guess, I'd like to appreciate Commissioner Wick's flexibility. I'm wondering if we could create some conditions or some language that indicates that, there were so many questions and comments made tonight, if we could craft a resolution that does say, the school board will use best efforts to respond to all of those questions in a timely manner, and share that information with the city council as well as the mayor, by certain deadlines, but that all is predicated on kind of wondering when the ballots need to be printed, because, you know,
Are you asking to do a resolution to add to the ballot language?
well, I guess I'm saying, like, what I'd like to see happen tonight is a resolution that signals our support to go forward with the November ballot.
I can answer your question.
Okay,
So
thank you.
to that point, which we did discuss, is that we could make this motion, approve this. Our Monday night meeting with City Council would be similar to this, where we would be answering those questions. And we would have to get confirmation from Council President Wright that September 11th would be the final, the date for ballot language to go on, so that we would have that time period to be able to exercise.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
Okay.
So, as the maker of the motion, I'm a little confused at whether we're altering the motion, or are we just going to make sort of an undertaking on the record that this is what we plan to do. That would be my suggestion, and to keep what we actually passed tonight official, very simple and clean.
Okay.
If that's okay. But clearly, we want to, given that we're going in this direction, we want to get all the questions answered as much as humanly possible, as soon as possible.
Maybe we're talking about the motion for the budget number.
Yeah, I
Instead
think
of the
you
ballot
said, I think
language.
you said it correctly the first time, and I support Commissioner Wick's suggestion that we vote on this, keep it clean, but also we make a commitment to add some conversations around flexibility around adding some conditions later on, but we do have some time to do that, but we need this authorization in order to move forward, and then we can have conversations around the next steps.
Just an authorization on the budget number. Do that one instead, and then we can vote on in our September meeting. On our motion, yeah.
I think we have to vote tonight on this at City Council on Monday.
No, we're saying they wouldn't be approving, they would be approving the budget. Oh, I hear what you're saying, yes, okay, thank you. Yeah, sorry, Commissioner Barlow, sorry, we're sharing a mic.
I just had a question about the note at the bottom of the possible motion, and whether or not we intend to incorporate that language into the full motion. I think we might want to, since it indicates a willingness on the part of the board to pursue alternative funding sources for where we can do so.
I, as the maker of the motion, I appreciate you brought that up, because I hadn't intended that be part of the actual motion. I think certainly we should attempt to do that. I guess I'd be curious to know if others would like to see that language. I am not inclined to add that language and to keep it clean, but then, of course, to have a further discussion about that. But based on what we talked about earlier, it was my understanding that the likelihood of alternate funding sources, as told to us by consultants of the superintendent, was kind of low. But in any event, I don't want to promise something that we then look like we can't deliver on. I'd rather have a positive surprise in any event. Okay.
Just to clarify, I remember the last time we had conversations with the city, we wanted to enter the ballot language to go and have the conversation on 27th, but I believe that the timeline is September. It's in September. So we could commit to be clean and say, okay, we have a option to start moving forward to talk with City Council about. And if there was a modification to the ballot language that the board wanted to do, we could certainly find out exactly what the timeline is in September. We could do that at that point.
So, just so I understand, are we still?
Still on your motion.
Okay, thank you.
Still on your motion.
Okay.
Commissioner Fisher.
So two things. Number one, Commissioner Ivanchik just texted me that she would like to vote on this. So I don't know what protocol is.
Telephonic is fine.
Yeah, just call her.
Okay. So secondly, can you explain why, if scenario C is 68.5, why you propose 70?
Why did I propose 70? I think I heard enough from John and others, Councilor Dean, and my own concern about the air conditioning, my own belief that trying to cost out a project a number of years in advance, and I've never seen a project that comes in under budget, and almost always it's over budget. I bet if you had data, So I don't want us to be caught short. So that's why, really. I'd rather have a little excess capacity because it's up to, and by golly, if John can tell us later that he can do it for 62, fabulous. Or 58. That's why.
Any other? Yep.
So I guess I am curious about, I thought, the goal here was to signal to the city council that we are committed to moving forward in November. I'm a little confused about why we need to vote on this specific bond language.
Oh, it was my understanding that that's what they'll be voting on. If not on the 27th of August, then September 11th or something like that. So that
okay.
they wanted a clear signal from us, yay or nay,
Okay.
when, how much.
Got it. Thank you.
Great. Okay. Any more discussion on the motion? Okay, we'll do a roll call vote.
Okay.
All right, do you want to read the motion?
So without having to recite the whole thing, I think for the record, could we waive the reading and
We've read it
vote
several
on
times.
this thing? It's right behind us.
Okay.
At 70,070,000, not including the note.
Okay, a roll call. So Commissioner Curry?
Aye.
Please.
Sorry.
Yeah, okay. Just getting the names ready. Okay.
Commissioner
Aye.
Curry? Aye. Commissioner Wick?
Aye.
Commissioner Fisher?
Nay.
Commissioner Ivanka?
Yay, yes.
Thanks. Commissioner Pillsbury?
Yes.
Commissioner Carey?
Yay.
Commissioner Barlow?
Yes.
Commissioner Olwell?
Yes.
And Commissioner Gorman?
Yes.
Great, then the motion carries. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Next on the agenda is to adjourn.
I move to
Thank you.
Second.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes.